We live in an era of popularity of genres such as popadanchestvo and reincarnation. The beginning of such novels is often the same. The main character walks down the road, reading a favorite novel, while somewhere around the corner a deadly truck is already waiting for him. Then, after death, the main character is reborn, or ends up in the body of a character from the novel. And it so happened that the heroine of this story, Cho Erin, dreamed of something like that. The thing is, she has neither talents nor goals in life, which she lives in vain. Erin broke off relations with people who were hard to call parents, so she doesn't even have a family. And if you think about it, her life was quite difficult and the complete opposite of the main heroine of one novel. It is called The Precious Daughter of the Duke, and tells about a child who is loved by everyone but is going to run away from home due to misunderstandings with the family. Erin regularly reads this story, although it is not at all to the taste of the girl. The thing is, there is a superstition. The more a person comments on a work, the higher the chance of ending up in it. Only Erin likes completely different works. One of them is called Return of the Sword God. It is a martial arts novel in which the main character returns after his clan was destroyed by a demonic cult. However, despite her love for this story, Erin did not want to comment on it because she was afraid of getting into it. But while crossing the road, the girl accidentally entered the comments section. The green traffic light was already flashing, but Erin was busy with her smartphone. This became her fatal mistake, because the next moment Erin heard a sharp honking sound. The last thing the girl managed to think about before the world was engulfed in darkness was the desire to be in a story where children are cared for. And then Erin felt cold and saw a clear sky in front of her. The girl realized she was lying on the floor, but for some reason it was hard for her to move. And when Erin looked at her own hands, she saw the hands of a baby instead. Now denying reality was already useless. Erin had become a newborn baby. And judging by the fortress walls and gates next to which she was lying, the girl assumed that this was an Eastern country. But then Erin was overcome by a bad premonition, because this place definitely did not resemble the novel The Precious Daughter of the Duke. Even if this is not the world of Return of the Sword God, it is definitely connected to Eastern culture, which means Erin had been reading novels that did not suit her preferences in vain. She saw neither signs nor streets, and Erin did not dare to scream for help because there could be bad people behind the walls. However, contrary to her fears, a young man dressed in a novice's habit appeared from behind the gates. And seeing the baby lying on the doorstep, he was stunned on the spot and quietly asked, "Where are the parents?" Erin herself would have liked to know, but fortunately the novice recovered from the shock and quickly picked up the baby in his arms and ran into the temple with him. From the doorstep, the young man loudly called the head, but he was not alone. The novice did not know that the head was currently holding a meeting with the elders, so he decided to come back later. However, the head stopped the young man and ordered him to show the child to him. Erin had no idea who this elder was, but he terrified her terribly. Meanwhile, the novice, whose name was Yihyun, did as he was told and reported that the baby was lying at the temple gates and that his guardians were not nearby. Then in response, the head loudly asked, "Who would climb Hwashan to abandon a child?" Erin shuddered at his bass voice, but one word seemed very familiar to her. And then she remembered that Hwashan is a noble cult, one of the 10 greatest. And this means that because Erin read novels about parental love and martial arts, she ended up in a romance combining both these directions. From realizing this, Erin panicked and asked herself, what should she even do in this chaos? However, then the Haid took Erin in his arms and sympathetically stated that her parents acted heartlessly. It was then that Erin understood she still had a chance if this elder decided to keep her and raise her here in the temple. However, contrary to all genre laws, the head ordered Uihyun to take the baby to the residential area, since the temple cannot take care of her upbringing. At these words, Erin widened her eyes and panicked even more than before. After all, if some hermit does not pick her up, she will wander like a beggar, or live as a servant in a guest house constantly broken into by people skilled in martial arts. Erin could not allow this, so she grabbed Uihyun's clothing with all her might. And when the surprised acolyte looked at her, Erin made puppy eyes and mentally ordered him, "Raise me." Then Uihyun decided to ask Erin just in case if she wanted to stay here, to which she actively nodded. At such a sight, the head laughed and asked, "Has anyone ever seen such a smart child?" Then in response, one of the elders suggested that perhaps fate itself brought the baby to their temple. The leader liked it, and since Erin was sent by fate, he decided to give her the name Bion, which means touch of fate. Yikion was surprised that the leader gave the child a Taoist name, to which he explained that in any case he intended to raise Bion as a follower of Hwashan. It was then that Erin realized that her plan had a flaw, because a Taoist name meant that she was now a disciple of the sect. And that meant she was to expect training and dedicating her life to Taoism. So now Bion had lived in the Hwashan temple for a week. But during the short time, several events occurred. Yikion, the novice who picked up Bion, began to look after her. All week Bion slept when she wanted, and if she asked, she was fed baby food, so she was quite satisfied with her life. Only Bion would have liked to exclude morning reading of Taoist books from her new life. The leader was raising her as a follower of Huashan, but Bion did not understand. Why read books to a child who was not even a year old, if she would forget everything after her nap? But more importantly, although Bion wanted to stay in Huashan, her favorite was the cult of shamans from the novel Return of the Sword God. Only Bion did not know how the leader would react if in the future she said she wanted to go to the shamans. But then worries about the future receded into the background, because after long reading, Bion became very hungry. She still had enough dignity not to cry from hunger, so Bion simply pulled the head by a strand of gray hair. However, he mistakenly thought that Bion was asking him to read faster, so he smiled and promised to read her as many books as she wanted. Then Bion forgot about dignity and burst into tears throughout the temple. Fortunately, Yikion immediately came upon hearing her crying. He explained that it was time to feed the baby, to which the head admitted that he had completely lost track of time. But then he suddenly thought and suggested that Yikion introduce Bion to the beauty Ji, since as a follower, she should visit her at least once. In response, Yikion agreed to the proposal and, looking out the window at the mountain peak, said that Bion would like her. Of course, Bion was curious where the head had sent Yikion with the infant, but she did not expect to climb up an endless staircase. Yikion had been climbing it for an hour but showed no signs of fatigue, which made Bion admit that in her past life she would have given up long ago. She also began to fear that this walk might turn out to be some kind of Spartan training. But finally, Yikion reached the mountain peak, and there Bion was awaited by a plum orchard. Their pink flowers reminded one of spring, and the white ones looked like snowflakes. And in the very heart of the blooming grove was a pond so clear that Bion could see its bottom. And gazing at this incredible landscape, which could be called paradisiacal, Bion realized that the summit of Mount Huashan was the beauty Z. In her past life, Bion had never been to such a place, and therefore she was filled with joy at the realization that she was truly born here. But Bion was not allowed to calmly enjoy this peaceful atmosphere, as someone called out to Yihyun. It was a breathless novice who reported that Elder Muchjin was looking for Yihyun, to which he replied that he would come soon. Bion had not stayed in the garden for even 5 minutes, and so she began to complain and act spoiled. Yihyun understood that the child surely wanted to see more, but he had urgent matters to attend to. Therefore, Yihyun called out to someone who had been lying on a plum tree branch all this time and asked him to come down. A second later, a novice with a sword at his waist jumped down from the tree, and Bion knew him. His name was Yisun, and Bion knew him because earlier he had brought her to the training ground, thinking that holding a baby in his arms would prevent him from being scolded. Meanwhile, Yihyun asked to show Bion the garden, since Yisun was doing nothing anyway, but he stated that raising a child was not idleness. Then Yihyun smiled and hinted that he would tell Sasuke that Yisun had skipped training here. In response, he took Bion as instructed, and Yihyun added at the end that Yisun did not take his eyes off the child and did not put her on the ground. After that, Yihyun left, but Bion wondered, will she really be okay? As soon as Yihyun left, Yisun immediately put Bion on the ground and said that she was being overprotected. Since ancient times, a baby must be able to crawl on their own hands and feet, and the lower part of the body is the foundation of martial arts, so Yisun allowed Bion to train in this way. Then he lay down under the plum tree and warned at the end that Bion should only play here, nearby, and not go near the water. If Bion could speak, she would tell Yisun everything she thinks, because he does not listen to what he is told but demands it from her. Therefore, Bion decided to do the same, not listen to Yisun and admire the pond. Carp lived in it, and seeing one up close, Bion's child instincts took over, and she wanted to touch the fish. But as soon as Bion touched the water surface, Yisun immediately grabbed her by the collar and pulled her away from the water. Bion thought he was sleeping, but Yisun did not stop watching her with one eye. Then he carried Bion back to the plum tree and on the way told her that a water demon lived in the pond, devouring children. But Bion was not going to believe this crazy story and began to throw a tantrum. Yisun guessed that she wanted to see the carp and yet, surrendering, carefully brought Bion to the pond. But while she was looking at the fish, Yisun suddenly admitted that there was a reason why he missed training sessions. And then he declared that he was a kind of genius, which Bion naturally did not believe. Then Yisun laid her on the ground and said that it is better to see once than to hear. But as soon as Yisun grabbed the sword hilt, his gaze became sharp, and as if the very air around him grew heavier. And in the next moment he swung the sword and the flowers on the branches of the red plum immediately blossomed after him. Bion thought that Yisun was an ordinary lazy person, and there was nothing special about him. But thanks to him, she finally decided on the Huashan sect. Almost a year had passed since then, and one day the elder Muyon returned to the Huashan temple accompanied by her disciple Jin Yul. She asked the mentor if anything interesting could have happened during their absence, to which the elder stated that the most interesting thing here was the water lilies on the water. However, when Muyon and Jin Yul entered the temple, to their surprise they found a commotion and a child stained with ink. And when the elder and her disciple asked in unison where the baby came from in the temple, Bion realized she was in trouble. From the day Isan showed her swordsmanship skills surrounded by plum blossoms, Bion decided to change her preferences from the shaman cult to the Huashan sect. However, then Ahyun scolded Isan well for leaving her alone on the ground. After some time, the leader heard from Isan that Bion enjoyed watching him bloom flowers with his sword, so he gave her a wooden sword. But when the leader stepped out briefly, a fly flew into the room. It buzzed terribly, and Bion tried to swat it with the wooden sword but failed, and, getting angry, threw the sword, hitting a bucket of ink. Meanwhile, Jin Yul slyly wondered, who is the parent of this naughty child? But fortunately, Ahyun entered the room, greeting the elder and her disciple. Bion was extremely surprised because Muyon and Jin Yul looked to be the same age. Elders are responsible for internal sect affairs alongside the leader, but Muyon seemed too young for this role to her. Meanwhile, Ahyun explained to the guests that Bion was left at the temple gates, but then he realized the mess she had made. Then Muyon asked where the leader was, to which another disciple said that he had received a report about the appearance of the Black Dao in Huaim province, so now he is heading to Manhwa with the elders. Bion remembered that if warriors walking the righteous path are called the White Dao, then those who choose the path of villainy belong to the Black Dao. Meanwhile, the elder Muyon and Jin Yul decided to also go to Manhwa. From conversations, Bion found out that Muyeon holds the title Sword of the Fiery Plum, and she looks so young because she has achieved full enlightenment and completed the transformation of her body. As for her disciple, Jin Yul, despite still being young and not having undergone full initiation, the elder herself chose her. In Huashan, Jin Yul is considered a genius who has been spared the hardships of her peers, but Bion reasoned that if she were such a genius, she would not be able to withstand the envious glances of her peers. So she decided to train harder. But when she took the wooden sword in her hands, Jin Yul noticed that Bion was trying to imitate the plum blossom stance. However, Isan just laughed at Bion when he saw her efforts. Meanwhile, Jin Yul acknowledged that Bion was quite talented for a novice and decided to show her something. In the Sonin cave lived a pair of spiritual snakes, and Jin Yul intended to give the core of one of them to the leader. She only defeated the male and deliberately left the female alive so that someone like Bion could also take the snake's core when she grew up. However, Bion was horrified at the thought that in the future she would have to hunt a poisonous snake that had lost its partner. But then Jin Yul said that Bion was not yet a genius, but her talent was noticeable. So Jin Yul hoped that this talent would become a blessing for her. Then Bion decided that since she was born with talent in the world of martial arts, she would use it to the fullest. Meanwhile, the leader returned and was very glad that Bion and Jin Yul had already met. But then Jin Yul asked when Bion's birthday was, since she would soon be 1 year old. However, neither the leader nor anyone in Huashan knew this, so an urgent meeting was called to choose Bion's birthday. Yuihyun suggested choosing the day when she first appeared at the temple, but the problem was that the leader could not remember when that was, and Yuihyun, to his shame, couldn't either. Then one of the elders suggested choosing today's date. Everyone supported this idea, and Yuihyun decided to take a walk with Bion around the temple grounds so that everyone could congratulate her on her birthday. One of the first to volunteer was a novice named Yuigan, who asked why they chose exactly today's date for the girl. In response, Yuihyun confessed guiltily that the council wanted to choose the day of her arrival in Huashan, but unfortunately no one remembered the date. But then Yuisun approached Yuihyun and confidently stated that it was 5 months and 1 day ago. Yuihyun asked if he was sure, to which Yuisun assured that he was sure because that day was his own birthday. This is how everyone in Huashan learned Bion's birthday, but Yihyun still decided to congratulate her on today's day. He lifted Bion above his head and smiled, thanking her for appearing in Huashan. Since Bion joined the sect, 3 years have passed. Time flew by quickly, and she turned 4. On this fine day, Bion slipped away from Yihyun again to climb the stairs to the plum orchard. In 3 years of living in Huashan, she was convinced that everyone here dreamed of making her a disciple of Jin Shan. Its disciples are the main part of the Huashan sect. They are incomparable to those who study martial arts outside the main school. Their names are recorded in the sect's records, and they also receive privileges of a completely different level. But considering how often Bion climbed the mountain stairs, she was destined to become a professional mountaineer in the future. This time she got so dirty that finally reaching the top, she decided to rinse off in the pond. But as soon as Bion took a step toward the water, Yisun immediately grabbed her and said disapprovingly that in her past life she was definitely a fish. He knew the girl had run away from Yihyun again, but still asked what she was doing here, to which Byeon said she just wanted to wash her hands. Yisun realized that Byeon was climbing the stairs on all fours again, so he said in a didactic tone that well-mannered people use their feet to walk. Then he brought Byeon to the pond and carefully washed her. Well, after bathing, Byeon finally admitted that she wanted to see the waterfall, to which Yisun reasonably asked, why? Then Byeon explained that she wanted to train in the waterfall like Jin Yul and Elder Muyeon. In response, Yisun lightly tapped her on the crown and said that 4-year-olds are not allowed near the waterfall. Then Byeon asked when she would be allowed, to which Yisun replied, when she grows up. Byeon regretfully realized that she would have to wait a few more years, and until then she would be treated like a child. Meanwhile, Yisun headed to the stairs and offered to carry Byeon in his arms, but she refused, stating that this way she would not increase her endurance. But the descent turned out to be more difficult than Byeon thought, so she quickly gave up and simply hung on Yisun's arm. He asked where Byeon had seen a student hanging on the teacher's arm, but she declared that Yisun is not a teacher. In response, he was indignant and asked, how did it happen that Byeon raised Yihyun, but she does not resemble him at all? Then Byeon, with an offended look, explained that Yihyun leaves her alone when he goes to training, so she stays with Yisun. He grumbled that it's hard to always play with a child who doesn't even understand words properly. But then Byeon stated that someone finds it much more interesting to play with her. Yisun immediately became alert and asked which idiot said such nonsense, to which Byeon replied that it was Yegan. And then she quickly ran down the steps and said she would tell Yegan that Yisun called him an idiot. Yisun immediately chased after the girl, but it was already too late. Byeon had called Yegan. He was glad that Byeon was found and said that he had specially bought her favorite cookies. But when Byeon was about to tell Yegan something, Yisun quickly snatched the bag of cookies from his hand and offered them to the girl. Byeon immediately forgot what she wanted to say when Yisun gave her one cookie. Yegan was touched and asked to give her another one, but Yisun objected, saying that Byeon would spoil her appetite before lunch. And when Yegan left on his own business, Yisun whispered to Byeon to keep secret what he said then. But in response, Byeon declared that if Yisun taught her the first technique of the plum blossom, she would agree to keep silent. Yisun was amazed that a 4-year-old girl could remember that, but still warned that Byeon could not yet control her ki, so all she would see was a simple swing. Therefore, first of all, Byeon must learn to control her chi, and only then will Yisun teach her the technique. Byeon agreed to such conditions, and Yisun meanwhile had already carried her to the dining hall. At her entrance, they were met by a worried Yikyun, who asked, where had Byeon disappeared? Then he wiped the dusty face of the girl with a handkerchief, and asked her to always inform where she intended to go from now on. But Byeon considered this excessive care, since in Huashan there was nothing but slippery stone cliffs, and the only place to go was the plum orchard at the top. Meanwhile, Yihyun invited everyone to the table, but to Byeon's surprise, meat dishes awaited her in the dining room, which were very rare in Huashan. Only she had already eaten cookies, because she planned to refuse another herb for lunch, citing its tastelessness. But if the truth came out, she would be forbidden sweets, so Byeon still decided to eat a little for appearances. But unfortunately, it did not last long for her. Byeon's stomach hurt, so the worried Yikyun suggested going to the doctor. Byeon immediately perked up and they decided to just take a walk, but Yegan untimely asked, could it be because of the cookies he gave her? After his words, a tense silence settled in the dining room. Then Yikyun asked Yegan how many pieces Byeon had eaten, and he admitted 4. Then Yikyun shifted his attention to Yisun and asked, why didn't he stop Yegan? Not having received an answer, Yikyun turned to Byeon and reproached her for lying and disobedience, to which the girl replied that it used to be called a survival skill. To this, Yikyun only sighed heavily and lamented why Byeon increasingly resembled Yisun as she grew older. But then, as a punishment, he ordered all 3 to kneel with their hands raised for 3 minutes. And he also forbade sweets for Byeon for 2 months. Then 2 acolytes ran into the dining hall and informed Yikyun that guests had arrived at Huashan, to which he ordered them to be invited inside. But Byeon wondered, who could have come to this steep mountain? All the residents of Huashan immediately began preparations for the important meeting. They were so flustered that they even forgot about Yikyun's ban on sweets for Byeon. However, such an event was happening for the first time since her arrival at Huashan, so Byeon wondered, how important must the guest be that everyone is trying so hard? Giving in to curiosity, she decided to find out for herself, and peeked out from behind the temple gates. And there Byeon saw a rather handsome boy. However, upon seeing her, he rudely asked, who is she and why is she staring like that? It was then that Byeon realized that the only beautiful thing about this brat was his face, and there was no sign of manners here. In that case, she did not remain in debt and answered the rude question with an equally rude one. And who are you yourself? In response, the boy did not give his name, but admitted that he was lost and looking for the way. Bion reasoned that since he was one of the guests, it was worth taking him to the Yonhua Hall to the leader and elders. Therefore, she beckoned the boy with her hand and ordered him to follow her. On the way to the hall, Bion asked how the boy had climbed Mount Huashan. In response, he said that he came with his father, Namgun Kichjin, and he himself was Namgun Sehon. Bion was surprised that the boy turned out to be a young master, and she also remembered that Namgun was among the elite families of Murim and was known for swordsmanship. But if the Namgun family had come to Huashan, then something must have happened in Murim. Bion still did not quite understand how this world was arranged, and at what point in history she was now. But she could not just sit still, because something bad is constantly happening in the world of martial arts. For example, the war between the heavens and demons, the Great War, or the war with the demonic cult. If something like that happens, 9 families will suffer, and there is a high probability that it will affect the Huashan sect as well. Meanwhile, Sehon suddenly asked if Bion lives here because she has no home, to which she irritably replied, yes. Then Bion wondered why this boy always pokes at the most painful spot, and decided to quickly hand him over to the adults. However, in the next moment Sehon suddenly pulled the hair tie from her hair. And when Bion turned around, the boy declared that he has much more beautiful things at home, and suggested going to his house. But in response, Bion could not say anything because she was speechless with surprise. Moreover, the hair tie was bought for her by Isin when he was descending from Mount Huashan. Bion really liked the gift and always used it carefully because she was afraid the hair tie might break. And this cheeky boy just took it away, which made Bion angry, and she immediately rushed to take back the hair tie. Meanwhile, Kichjin came out of the Yonhua Hall accompanied by Aehyun. The head of the Namgun family was worried about the disappearance of his son, while Oehyun tried in every way to assure him that he could not have left the upper palace. However, how surprised both were when Sehon was found, lying on Bion. And worst of all, they kissed, which in the modern world would be called accidentally collided lips. Only Bion did not care what this embarrassment was called now because she was terrified. The whole day passed in shock and fear, but the next day Bion faced another trial called mockery. Therefore, she decided to be alone until this commotion was forgotten, and until that annoying boy left. Bion was going to go up to the plum orchard, but as luck would have it, she ran into Sehon at the foot of the stairs. She immediately turned around, but the boy suddenly grabbed her by the clothes and again asked her to come to his house. And when Bion angrily asked why, Sehon shyly admitted that she was the first who did not pay attention to his appearance. That means Bion feels comfortable with him, so he invited her to come to his house. Bion was stunned by these words, because it turned out that Sehon was inviting her not because he fell in love, but simply because she did not annoy him. Bion did not know what to say in response and only wondered, what is wrong with this strange child? Meanwhile, Sehon shyly revealed that other children constantly annoyed him because they touched his face and followed him everywhere. Then Bion clasped Sehon's face with her hands and said that she could do the same. However, in response, Sehon stated that she was completely different. Bion flared up and asked how exactly, to which the boy blushed and explained that she was the first to get angry when she looked at him. Bion could no longer tolerate this farce and, turning around, grumbled to Sehon that in the future he would meet other such people. But the boy did not give up, and quickening his pace, Bion added that if they were seen together, people would laugh. Then Sehon asked why, to which Bion wearily reminded him of yesterday. The boy's face instantly reddened with embarrassment, which made Bion hope that he was finally beginning to understand. However, the next moment Sehon suddenly grabbed her sleeve and declared that he was lost. Bion could not leave a 4-year-old lost child alone, so she agreed to escort him to the main temple building. Only on the way they kept encountering novices who did not miss the chance to tease the young pair. Bion knew that if she fell for the provocations, they would laugh for a long time, so she decided to pass by calmly. However, in the next moment, Bion heard a novice named Yusanso say that he was envious, because as soon as the girl was abandoned at the temple gates, she was immediately given a place among the disciples. By the flower mark on the novice's clothing, Bion understood that he was a 3rd-generation disciple. Meanwhile, Yusanso's friend added that he wished his parents had abandoned him so successfully. Because the people around were kind to Bion, she gradually began to forget that not everyone in Huashan was friendly towards her. But Bion did not want to grow weak, so she firmly told Yusanso that she preferred to hear complaints to her face. Then she added that if Yusanso had failed the Jinshan exam, he should not take it out on her. But in response, Yusanso rudely poked Bion in the forehead with his finger and mockingly asked, "Did she say everything?" Then Bion also asked in return, "Does Yusanso really think that envy of a 4-year-old will make his life better?" At these words, he got angry and declared that Bion's life was miserable, and that being abandoned at the gates of Huashan was the best thing that had happened to her. But Yusanso did not stop there, and continuing to angrily poke Bion with his finger, called her a bitch orphan. In response, Bion said nothing, and then Yusanso mockingly suggested she cry and call the elders. Only he clearly forgot the Murim law. Always respond to good and evil. Bion well learned this law, and therefore sharply grabbed Yusinsen's index finger with both hands. And in the next moment, a crunch was heard, and immediately grabbing his hand, Yusinso cried out in pain. With a satisfied look, Bion jumped aside, mentally gloating over the offender. Only she forgot something important. It would be suspicious if she was completely fine. So Bion deliberately fell to her knees and hit her forehead hard on the ground. And then came the turn of the final touch. Bion shouted across all Huashan and called the leader. Naturally, the leader himself could not run at her first call, but the lion's share of the followers could. From their crowd, Yihyun immediately rushed to Bion and took her in his arms. Then he gave Yusinsun a deadly look and angrily asked, "How could you do such a thing to a child?" Yusinso was brought to the Yonghua Hall, where serious problems of Huashan are resolved, and where the guilty party was already awaited by the leader along with the elders. Meanwhile, Sehon asked why Bion was banging her head on the ground, but she quickly shut him up. Bion did not want the boy to blurt out anything unnecessary, so she stated that this matter concerns only Huashan, so Sehon is unnecessary here. However, in response, Yigan only scolded Bion and said that interrupting adults is not allowed. Meanwhile, the leader cleared his throat and stated that recently, 2 people in Huashan were injured, and they all gathered here to find out what really happened. However, despite his age, the leader gave the first word to Bion. Since ancient times, the first phrase is considered the most important. So Bion pointed at Yusinsun and declared that before she broke this man's finger, he called her a bitch orphan. And the best achievement in her life is that she was abandoned at the gates of Huashan. Also, Yusinsun was interested in seeing the faces of the parents who climbed the steep mountain to get rid of the child. Bion could have said much more, but Yihyun stopped her and asked her not to keep these words in her heart or remember them. Then he hugged Bion tightly, and glaring fiercely at Yusinsun, declared that this scum is not even worth her glance. Yusinso got nervous, and with a forced smile told Bion that she should not invent things that never happened. However, Sehon stated that he heard everything, and that is exactly what Yusinso said. The words of the heir of the Namgun family, Yusinso, could not be denied, especially in the presence of the leader. Meanwhile, the leader asked sternly, "For what reason did Yusinso say such a thing to the child?" Yusinso was ashamed and afraid to admit it, so Bion answered for him, saying that it was all because a place was left for her in Jinshan. However, to her surprise, the head responded that it was absurd, and Bion would not get the position just like that. Then the head told Bion that one must not break people's fingers, and ordered Yusonsun to go to the Temple of Repentance and think about his behavior there. The trial ended there, but Bion did not feel like a winner because it turned out she had no privileges. Next to the Yonhua Hall bloomed a small garden where Bion decided to seclude herself with Sehon just to rest. But after some time spent in silence, Sehon suddenly asked, "Does it mean that she has no mother?" In response, Bion reminded him that she was a foundling, so she had no father either. But then Sehon declared that he had a father, which made Bion slightly angry. At first, she thought Sehon was boasting, but then it dawned on her that it meant he had no mother either. Because of this, Bion felt guilty towards the boy. But then Sehon suddenly confessed that today he was returning home, to Anhui, and so he extended his hand to Bion and asked one last time, would she go with him? Bion was touched and replied that in Huashan she had no problem being an orphan, but if she went with Sehon, it would become a problem. Then Sehon asked why, to which Bion smiled and explained that she did not want to rely on the gratitude of others. In Huashan, Bion is on equal footing with everyone, but if she goes with Sehon, their relationship will fall into class boundaries. If an orphan appears in the Namgun family, will the young master's gaming friend later become someone with a status higher than just a servant? And what is more important, here, in Huashan, is her family and her home, so Bion does not intend to leave it. Sehon objected, saying that the people here are strangers to Bion, but she declared that family is not limited only to blood ties. After these words, Sehon finally accepted the refusal and noticeably became sad. Bion tried to cheer him up and suggested studying here in Huashan, but in response, Sehon said that he likes his home more than this disgusting mountain, which made Bion barely restrain herself from hitting him. But then Sehon was called by his father, because it was time to return home. Then at the end, Sehon told Bion that if she feels sad, she should definitely come to Anhui, where she will be welcomed at any time. And then Sehon suddenly hugged Bion tightly in farewell, which she did not expect at all. Well, when he left, Isun approached Bion and said that she should use the hair ribbon he gave her because her hair was completely disheveled. Bion immediately grabbed her head and with horror discovered that her shoelace was missing. And in the next moment, she shouted across all Huashan that this petty thief should return her shoelace immediately. A few days later, Yusinso finally left the Temple of Repentance and met Bion in the courtyard of the Yonghua Hall. He apologized for his words and offered her to become his disciple, but Beyond did not hurry to answer. She noticed that his finger had not yet healed, and he had probably suffered in the Temple of Repentance. But more importantly, Beyond did not hear sincerity in Yusinso's words, as if he was forced to say it. Therefore she asked, could a person with such a character teach her? At these words Yusinso began to get angry, and Beyond only added that before teaching others, one must first know oneself. Only behind the cunning and sarcasm, Beyond hid inner anxiety, because she also suffered because of that clash. Lately, because of this, Beyond has been sleeping poorly. She thought she would easily get a place as a disciple of Jin Shan. She thought she was specially prepared for this, but it all turned out to be just her delusion. In the end, the next day, Beyond came to the training ground of Jin Shan's disciples. She decided that even if she did not take a place among the students, she must understand the level of her abilities. To master martial arts and make the plum blossom bloom, Beyond would need to master 24 techniques of the plum flower, but now she only knows the first 5 seconds of the first technique. Isan promised that he would help with training if Beyond learned to feel the internal energy, qi, and this is exactly where she decided to start. But how? At first, Beyond wanted to ask Yikion for help, but he might say that it was dangerous or that he would teach her later. Then Beyond decided that if Yikion saw her training with a real sword, he would take it away and teach her something safer, for example, control of internal energy. However, as soon as Beyond grabbed the sword's scabbard, all the students immediately began to cheer and praise her. Beyond was stunned by such a reaction, sincerely not understanding why no one stopped her. But fortunately, she was very stubborn, so although with difficulty, she still managed to raise the sword above her head. Only the sword was heavy, which caused Beyond to immediately lose her balance and start to fall backward. Fortunately, Yikion managed to catch her in his arms at the last second, and when he put Beyond on her feet, he asked her to give the sword back, but she stubbornly declared that she would not give it up. Then Yikion tried to explain that playing with the sword was dangerous, but Beyond only became more capricious and declared that she would not give it up until she learned to swing it. Ai Hien no longer knew what to do, but the other students advised teaching Beyond something more suitable. For example, 6 techniques of harmony. Ihyun listened to the advice and suggested Beyond conduct training without a sword. She immediately agreed, and then Yikion led her to the vicinity of the training ground. Secluding themselves there and taking the lotus pose, Yikion asked Beyond to close his eyes, then take a deep breath and slowly exhale. Beyond did as she was told, and then Yikion revealed that everything in the world has energy. The tree, the fire, and even the lake on the mountaintop. Inside Beyond it also exists. The energy around is called external, and the one inside is internal. Only such a detailed explanation for a fan of martial arts novels was unnecessary. Beyond already knew all this, but she had to listen carefully, as she had never tried to do anything like that before. However, soon Yikion suddenly fell silent, and after a while Beyond still dared to ask, is he going to tell her the correct method? But in response, Yikion just smiled and said that you just need to feel your inner energy, and that's all. That was when Beyond realized that this was a true Spartan method of teaching. But she still decided to try it. Only Ihyun had to constantly wake Beyond because the girl simply fell asleep due to prolonged meditation. In the end, it took Beyond 2 weeks just to feel even the external energy. It was then that Yikion decided it was time to study one of the 6 basic harmony techniques for energy control. Beyond immediately perked up and prepared to listen to Yikion attentively. But he said that all that was needed to master it was to stretch the head upward, feel everything, and breathe with the abdomen. Beyond did not understand anything, and then Yikion explained with a smile that she should align her head and straighten her neck. Also, Beyond should feel and recognize everything happening around her. These conditions seemed difficult to Beyond, but she was not going to retreat. Beyond did as Yikion told her, and gradually she felt something in the area below the navel. It was then that Beyond realized that after 2 weeks, she had succeeded for the first time in performing energy circulation. Meanwhile, Yisun was idling again, dozing on a plum tree branch. The weather was wonderful, and what kind of training could there be on such a day? But soon his daytime nap was interrupted by Beyond's persistent little voice. Yisun asked irritably what she needed, to which the girl proudly declared that she had mastered energy circulation in 2 weeks, so now Yisun must teach her the first technique. In response, he sincerely rejoiced at the success and agreed, since the leader personally performed the Bulmo cleansing. Beyond heard about something like this for the first time, so she asked, "What is it?" Then Yisun explained that it is the washing out of all negative energy from the body and the purification of the spirit. Then he stroked Beyond's head and told her that the leader had already done this cleansing when she was younger, and only children from influential families get this experience at such a young age. Beyond was surprised that she had already undergone the cleansing. and she had always thought that her position in Huashan was limited to that of a foundling. Meanwhile, Yisun took his sword and declared that since he promised, he would teach Bion the first technique of the plum blossom. She immediately rejoiced and asked, "Will Yisun explain the basics to her?" But in response, he said that the basics are what the student must realize through understanding the teacher's words, their repetition, and adaptation. Then Bion declared that Yihyun said exactly the same, to which Yisun irritably said that she should never compare him to others. However, after 2 weeks of training, Bion fell into despondency. It was painful to look at her. So one day the leader could not stand it and asked, "Why does his little girl sigh so heavily?" Then in response, Bion still admitted that she hit the wall of reality and realized that she was not a genius at all. When on the first day of training, Yuisen gave her a lecture, Bion did not even understand a third of his words. And on the second day, practice began, but every movement of Bion was incorrect. Of course, Yuisen calmed her down, saying that failures are quite normal for a child, and if Bion had succeeded on the first try, then a real commotion would have started. But even so, Yuisen did not stop considering Bion either a genius or a hidden master. Meanwhile, the chief asked, "Why does Bion not tell him about her worries?" In response, she muttered that it was all because the failure of others meant her own failure as well. Then the chief asked her to tell him exactly what Bion was failing at. In response, she still sadly told that Yuisen taught her the first technique, plum blossom. But she could not make the flower bloom, although she perfectly repeated the movements. Hearing this, the chief was surprised and decided to clarify. Was Bion so upset only because of this? Bion nodded and said that she would not be able to pass the exam if there was nothing special inside her. The chief gave her a Taoist name, but Bion was afraid that she would not be able to become a person worthy of it. She has no privileges, nor great talent, so Bion began to wonder. Would she even be able to pass the selection and become one of the candidates? But the next moment, the leader soothingly patted Bion on the head and said that it did not matter whether she became a disciple of Jin Shan or not, her name would always be Bion. Therefore, she should not fear failures, because in them one can find answers on how to achieve success. But then Bion asked what to do if she constantly fails, to which the leader pondered, and then said that in such a case one should ask the teacher for help. And then Bion had an idea. The 2 greatest geniuses of the sect, Elder Muyon and Jin Yul, were currently in Huashan. So she quickly cheered up and declared that she urgently needed to go. Elder Muyon was found meditating under a waterfall. At first, Bion decided to inquire, how long did it take her to master the first technique, plum blossom? To which the elder replied, 1 day. From this, Bion once again felt like a complete nobody, until Muyon asked, had she mastered the first technique? In response, Bion admitted that she was not succeeding, and still clarified, did the elder really master the technique in just 1 day? Then Muyon revealed that before she understood the plum blossom unfolding technique, she studied sword techniques and repeated the falling petals technique 1,000 times. And before that, Muyon practiced 6 harmony techniques until she had completely mastered them perfectly. But Bion is still a child and too impatient for a 4-year-old. In response, Bion recalled the saying, the earlier you start, the better. But the next moment, a breathless Jin Yul ran up to the waterfall. After catching her breath, she informed the mentor that Elder Mugen was looking for her. Mugen did not make him wait, and before leaving entrusted his student to look after Bion. Meanwhile, the leader summoned Aison to his office to find out why he taught Bion the basics of the plum blossom technique. In his defense, Aison said that Bion had been pestering him with this request, so although not everything, he told her a little about the technique. Then Aison apologized to the leader for not informing him. However, in response, the leader explained that he called Aison not to scold him. Aison became wary, and then the leader stated that training should not end with just reading theory and a little practice. Then he told how Bion came to him crying because she could not make the plum blossom bloom, and she was also worried that she would not pass the entrance exam. Aison thought that Bion was always carefree, so the leader's words shocked him. He immediately began to explain that he never demanded Bion to unleash the plum blossom, to which the leader only sighed heavily. But then he admitted that he was impatient. After all, Bion is a child who received a name in Huashan. Because of this, she constantly worries about growing up worthy of that name. So this situation is a lesson not only for the leader but also for Yuisen. In the end, the leader advised him to carefully consider the role of a teacher before taking on a student, and with that, let him go. But not far from the office, Yuisen suddenly remembered Bion's words that he had no talent for teaching others. Earlier, Yuisen would have argued with her, but now he was forced to admit that it was still too early for him to be a teacher. Meanwhile, Jin Yul praised Bion for being able to raise a real sword. Bion did not expect such kind words from her, so she asked, how long did it take Jin Yul to make the plum blossom bloom? In response, the elder student pondered and admitted that in those years she was impatient, so the training took about a week. Jin Yul was afraid she would not be able to make the plum blossoms bloom, so she hurried, and this haste became poison for her. But then Bion asked, "Doesn't haste make a person more decisive?" To which Jin Yul smiled and explained that it is not so. The essence of Tao is in cleansing and organizing thoughts, so it is difficult to comprehend if there is chaos in the mind. But then Jin Yul admitted that it was still difficult for her to master the techniques, because there is a reason why the plum blossom technique is the highest martial art. Therefore, Jin Yul advised Bion not to ignore the basics so as not to regret it later. Bion was surprised by Jin Yul's words and admitted that she was significantly different from Yue-san, even though they were both geniuses. But then Bion realized and asked, "Aren't geniuses those who are good at something difficult from the very beginning?" In response, Jin Yul assured that such people do not exist, because a true genius is one who starts from the basics and gradually achieves success. Then Bion understood that the main thing is the basics, and in the end, the only way for her was persistent training. By that time, Jin Yul was escorting Bion back to the temple, and they both said goodbye to each other. However, soon Bion met a very displeased Yue-san, who asked, why did she turn to the leader and not to him? In her defense, Bion said she was worried, to which Yue-san stated that the leader is now also worried, and he got blamed because of it. However, in reality, Yue-san understood that he had been too selfish, and it would have been better to start with basic training. Therefore, he admitted his guilt and as an apology promised to do everything possible to ensure Bion definitely passed the exam. Only Bion was horrified by such a promise, because it meant that she practically had no choice. From that day, Bion began training with Yi-san, but for the training sessions, he chose an unexpected place. This training ground was smaller than the one in the temple and was located far away, which is why it was rarely used, but Bion remembered how she used to secretly run here to play. Meanwhile, Yi-san tied bars to her belt and explained that these were weights instead of sandbags, since Bion was still too small. Bion asked what they were for, to which Yi-san pointed to the ground and explained that it was for running. Then Bion clarified how many laps she needed to run, but Yi-san replied that he would not say when to stop yet. Yi-san himself would run alongside, but if Bion stopped, he would add another bar to her weight. Then Yi-san clapped his hands and Bion immediately started running. The training continued even when the day turned to sunset, and then the out-of-breath Bion finally dared to ask when they would finish. But Yi-san calmly stated that the training would end when he wanted, to which Bion indignantly asked, "Are they really preparing for an exam?" Then Yi-san explained with a sinister look that Bion lacked physical strength, and if her body was light, more strength would remain for thinking. Bion was surprised and asked, "Does that mean they are now only doing physical training and not sword training?" Then Yi-san offered her two options, either continue running or do 1,000 sword swings. In response, Bion almost burst into tears and without hesitation chose to keep running. However, the next day she couldn't move due to muscle pain. As for Yue-san, Ui-hyun got very angry at him and gave him a good beating. A lot of time had passed since the training began, and once during lunch in the cafeteria, Yue-san let slip that soon Bion would meet peers her age. At such news, she immediately perked up and asked if that meant she would finally come down from the mountain, but unfortunately Yue-san answered negatively. However, Ui-hyun explained that soon there would be a meeting of the dragon and the tiger. On that day, Huashan and Wudang, belonging to the same faction, participate in an exchange of experience. To strengthen relations, they hold joint competitions and share information. However, Bion still did not understand what Wudang had to do with it, because if we are talking about the 9 great sects, there are much more hostile Cheongnam. In response, Yue-san was outraged and stated that even among the 9 sects there are different levels, but Cheongnam can never compare to Huashan. Bion did not expect Yue-san to react that way, but now she learned that in this world Huashan and Cheongnam cannot stand each other. Then she asked if Huashan often communicates with Wudang, to which Yue-san replied, once every 4 years. It turns out Bion was supposed to meet him when she was 1 year old, but she did not remember this event. Then Yi-san explained that last time Huashan visited Wudang, but this time they would come up here themselves. However, Bion still did not understand how she could meet peers when meeting them. To this question, Yi-san answered with a sly smile that this year Wudang accepted new students, and maybe they would take them with them so they could see Huashan. But then Bion became seriously worried, because peers might not want to play with her because she belonged to Huashan. In response, Yi-san strictly stated that Bion should not play with them, but show that she is on a higher level. However, in the next moment, Yi-hyun cooled his ardor by hitting him well, and ordered to teach Bion only good things. And so, as Yi-san said, the day of the meeting of the dragon and the tiger came. Only the atmosphere in Huashan was by no means solemn. Bion thought that today there would be a friendly spirit, but everyone had a mood as if a war would start in a second. But then the main gates opened and guests from the Wudang sect arrived at Huashan. Among all the sects that use sword techniques, Wudang is considered one of the three best. Moreover, Wudang is more devoted to Taoism than Huashan, and for the most part, they use soft sword techniques that combine elegance and strength. Wudang was Bion's favorite sect because its followers could use two types of internal energy. However, they all looked too young, which made Bion assume that a new generation had taken over Wudang. Meanwhile, the heads of both sects exchanged greetings and courtesies. While they were occupied, Bion decided to inspect the guests and suddenly saw a boy among the Wudang disciples. He also noticed Bion and, to her surprise, approached. Bion thought he wanted to greet her, but instead of a greeting, the boy smirked arrogantly and snorted. After that, Bion realized that Yisan was right, and you can't play with such brats. Before Bion saw the plum blossom technique, her favorite sect was Wudang, but that cheeky boy completely nullified her respect for that sect. But then among Bion's followers, she saw a rather attractive man who looked in her direction and suddenly nodded in greeting. Bion immediately blushed, thinking he had greeted her, but Yisan standing behind explained that the greeting was for him. Bion was surprised and immediately asked Yisan, was that his friend? In response, he reluctantly admitted that this was not a friend, but just a guy who annoyed him. Meanwhile, new Wudang disciples entered the Huashan temple. And among them, Bion noticed a girl who for some reason walked distantly and timidly behind everyone else. Then Bion realized that Wudang was not a paradise on earth either, because even in Huashan there were outcasts like Jin Yul. But then Bion snapped out of it and asked Yisan to tell her where the Wudang disciples would stay. Yisan assumed that Bion wanted to fight that boy, but in response she assured him that she just wanted to play a little with the other kids. Of course, Bion was being sly and in her thoughts was already imagining how she would beat that impudent boy. After she dispelled Yisan's suspicions, he still admitted that there was a small hole in the wall through which Bion could crawl into the Oxion territory. But as soon as she crawled through that hole, Bion immediately ran into the very same outcast girl from Wudang. She very shyly asked, on which side is the hospital or a place where she could get medicine? To Bion, this girl seemed too timid and very strange, since she was asking for directions from a person who had come out of a dog hole. Therefore, Bion asked why the girl needed to go to the hospital, to which she explained that the elders had asked her to bring medicine. Bion found this suspicious, since the Wudang disciples had just arrived in Huashan and already needed medicine. Meanwhile, the girl revealed that she had stood in this spot for about 15 minutes, waiting for someone to pass by. In response, Bion ordered to follow her, and on the way to the hospital explained that this building is used for guests, so students rarely come here. Then the girl asked if Bion was also a student of Huashan, to which she stated that she grew up here. But in response, the Wudang student suddenly jumped up to Bion and stared at her with a wide smile. Because of such a reaction, Bion stepped back and wondered, why is this girl looking at her like that? And she, with puppy-like delight, asked Bion if she had parents or relatives. To the unpleasant question, Bion answered negatively, which made the student immediately realize and begin to apologize with a guilty look. Bion was surprised by the girl's strange questions, but she decided not to raise the painful topic anymore and silently accompanied her to the hospital. Only at its doorstep did Bion speak again with the guest and asked, what exactly medicine does she need? In response, the girl shyly admitted that she needed medicine for indigestion, headache, and insomnia. At such an order, Bion joked whether the Wudang students were going to open a pharmacy, to which the girl blushed and decided in that case to take only the medicine for indigestion. Then Bion still could not hold back and stated that she was so restless that it was even irritating, to which the girl admitted that she often hears that. Soon Bion was discharged from the hospital and handed a pouch with medicines to her apprentice, for which she sincerely thanked her. But just as Bion was about to leave to attend to her own matters, the girl suddenly asked to be shown the way back. Bion could not just abandon the guest like that. And then Udan's apprentice finally introduced herself as Baek Gon and added that she was 7 years old. Now Bion understood why there was almost no height difference between them. But Baek Gon seemed too young to her for someone who had passed the exam. Meanwhile, Baek Gon asked what Bion's name was, to which she dryly introduced herself and said she was 5 years old. Then Baek Gon asked again why Bion had come to Okcheon, to which she lied that she was simply curious, since one cannot just pass into this place so easily. Of course, Bion could not admit that she intended to beat up that impudent fellow, but as luck would have it, he was waiting for her at the entrance to Okcheon. The boy's name was Baek Yul, and with his usual mocking smirk, he asked Baek Gon if she had brought the medicines. Baek Gon handed him the pouch, while Bion noticed that the other Udan apprentices were completely indifferent to her presence. But suddenly Baek Yul declared that Baek Gon was told to bring medicines for better digestion, not for indigestion. Baek Gon tried to explain that she clearly remembered the medicine for indigestion, But Baek had already thrown the pouch of medicines on the ground and said that she couldn't even carry out a simple task. Baek fell silent and blushed with shame, and Baek stepped on the pouch and added that this time she should do everything properly. For Bion, it was obvious that none of the students needed medicine, and that this Baek was simply mocking the girl. From her own experience, she knew that there would always be children in the world who were taught only bad things, so she decided to give this scoundrel a thrashing and help Baek. The latter was already about to cry, but the next moment Bion told Baek that with such a face he could easily digest everything himself. Then Baek turned his attention to Bion and asked how she dared to interfere in the affairs of another sect and lecture them, to which Bion explained that she was not a student of Huashan, but only lived here. But Baek just snorted and declared that probably Bion was also taken in by relatives after the death of her parents. Then Bion realized that Baek had lost her parents and was accepted into the Wudang sect because of a relative. But during the year that had passed since Bion was called an orphan, her opinion had not changed, and she still felt disgusted inside. Therefore, Bion stated that although she knew whether her parents were alive, she was well aware that speaking badly about other children's parents was disgusting. And as a bonus, Bion added with a sly smile that there is a saying, children are a reflection of their parents. In response, Baek immediately got angry and roughly grabbed Bion by the collar. Then he shouted angrily that Bion was not even a member of the Huashan sect, but just sucking up to them. At these words, Baek shrank and trembled with fear, which made Bion understand that the girl regularly heard such insults. Then Bion asked Baek, does he only know how to insult parents, or does he also master martial arts? Baek was taken aback by the question, but Bion continued and asked, when he grows up, will he also fight with insults instead of a sword? However, Baek did not have time to figure out what to answer, because the next moment Bion struck him hard in the face. From the blow, Baek began to fall backward, which surprised Bion, since the boy was 5 years older than her. But when Baek fell to the ground, Bion did not hesitate and immediately pounced on the offender from above. Then she began to hit Baek with punches and shout for him to stop spouting nonsense about privileges because of parents. However, the next moment the fight was interrupted by the senior student, who pulled Bion away from the boy. Then she asked Bion why she had fought with a student of Wudang, to which Bion advised asking Baek himself. The senior heeded the advice and sternly questioned the boy. Why did he quarrel with a child from another sect? In his defense, Baek said that Bion was not a member of Huashan, to which she slyly hinted that if she reported all the boy's words to the elder, he might have problems. Then Baek pointed to his bruised face and declared that it was a one-sided beating. But in response, the senior said that Baek actions could undermine trust between the two sects, and that he should be ashamed that he was beaten by a girl, and one much younger than him. Only after these words did Baek shamefully lower his eyes and apologize. Bion found his apology not particularly sincere, but she accepted it anyway. Then the elder suggested to part ways there, since if the adults found out, everyone would get in trouble. Bion also did not want to complicate things, so she agreed to the proposal without any problems. But as soon as she thought that everything would end well, at that very moment the mentors appeared in Okshaeon. In the end, the commotion was resolved. After the elders of both sects were summoned to discuss the situation, each sect punished the students at their discretion. Bion had to kneel with her hands raised for a whole 2 hours, while Iwihyun lamented all the time that fights should not be started. Then Bion still could not stand it, and in her defense stated that there are people in the world who understand words of reason only if they are beaten. Yuisun supported his student and reminded that she defeated a boy who was 4 years older than her. Even Iwihyun could not argue with this fact, so he allowed Bion to lower her hands and stand up. Bion immediately began to stretch her numb body, and then Baek timidly approached her and apologized for the inconvenience. But in response, Bion stated that Baek had no reason to apologize because the nasty boy was to blame for everything. Nevertheless, Baek bowed her head guiltily and said that if she had stopped Baek, it would not have ended like this. Only Bion initially intended to beat him up, so she assured that Baek would have gotten it anyway. But then Bion remembered the behavior of the senior student when she told her about what happened. Bion revealed that Baek called her an orphan, and also made Baek go for medicine, but then said the medicine was wrong and just threw it away. However, in response, the senior student said with an awkward smile that it seemed Baek simply could not exactly understand what was hurting him. That was when Bion realized that the senior did not take Baek's side and also felt hostility towards her. Baek is constantly depressed because she has no one on her side, which Bion could not ignore. Therefore, she told the girl that if she really regretted it, then instead of apologies, she should better help. Baek immediately agreed, and then Bion asked her to help get plum juice, which had just been prepared before the sect's gathering. But for that, they had to wait until it got dark and sneak into the cellar. First, they needed to fetch water stored in a large jug. Bion could not do it alone, so she decided to lift Paek Gon and she would scoop the water with a bowl. In response, Paek Gon suggested switching places, but Bion reminded her that she was stronger. Paek Gon no longer objected, and when Bion sat her down, she successfully filled a full bowl of water. Now it was possible to prepare plum compote, but Bion did not know in which pitcher the plum juice was stored, and in which the wine. Then Bion decided to simply try, but the taste of the contents of the pitchers was the same, from which she concluded that the wine simply had not yet matured. Since Paek Gon was a guest of Huashan, Bion yielded to her the right to try the plum compote first. However, after the first sip, Paek Gon reported that the compote was a bit bitter, and then the girl suddenly staggered backward and, leaning her back against the pitcher, she sat down on the floor. Bion was surprised by such a reaction, and Paek Gon meanwhile quietly admitted that she envied her because she could get angry so easily. And then tears appeared in the girl's eyes, and she revealed that her cousin grandfather was the elder of the Wudang sect. Paek Gon lost her parents due to the plague, and then her grandfather brought her to Wudang and forced her to take the exam to become a disciple of the sect. Now Bion understood why even the senior disciples treated Paek Gon with hostility. But then she wondered, why out of the blue did Paek Gon suddenly start complaining about her fate? Bion was sure that she had given the girl plum juice diluted with water, since she herself had tried it. But after trying the compote once again, Bion realized with horror that it was still plum wine. Only this morning Bion was scolded for a fight, and now Yiqian and her leader would definitely kill her. Of course, no one intended to kill Bion for such a fault, but she was scolded very harshly. The next day, competitions began in Huashan between the followers of two sects. One of the first to clash in the arena were Yi Son and his old acquaintance from Wudang named Zhongyi. Meanwhile, Bion asked Jin Yul why she was not participating in the competitions. In response, Jin Yul smiled and explained that her position in the sect was ambiguous, so she had never participated in competitions. Then Bion decided to quickly change the painful topic and said that Yi-sun was doing great. Jin Yul agreed with her and told that against Yi-sun, who earned the nickname Victory in 3 seconds, Zhongyi lasted a whole 10 seconds and also deserved a nickname. That was when Bion understood why Yi-sun did not recognize Zhongyi as a friend, but she also admitted that both opponents amazed with their skill. Therefore, Bion confidently declared that one day she would take part in a competition, and she hopes that by that time, there will be as many people as possible in Wudang who are like Zhongyi. The competition lasted until the evening, and all the way back to the Bion temple she enthusiastically praised the sword styles of Wudan and Huashan. Only Paek Gon, walking beside her, was in no way cheerful, which made Bion ask directly, why is she so depressed again? Then Paek Gon admitted that next time she would also have to participate, but she was not confident in victory. However, in response, Bion declared with a mischievous smile that in 4 years Paek Gon would be able to fight her. But as an apology for giving Paek Gon wine, she would allow herself to be hit once. Bion was about to say something else, but the next moment she noticed Zhongyi talking to Wi-son. Zhongyi said that this time he almost caught up with Wi-son, to which the latter replied irritably. And at that very moment, Bion jumped out of the bushes, which seriously frightened Wi-son. But Zhongyi remained calm, and then Paek Gon approached him and addressed him as a teacher. Since Bion saw Paek Gon off so late, Zhongyi assumed that the girls had become friends. Then Zhongyi admitted that he was worried because his student did not get along with other children, but now he was glad that Paek Gon had a friend from another sect. Then Wi-son told how Bion wanted to practice martial arts so much that she smashed an inkpot with a wooden sword. Bion did not want to listen about her dark past in front of Zhongyi, so she led Paek Gon away and said goodbye, promising to accompany her so Yusanso could have a proper talk with his friend. Soon the disciples reached Ocheon, but before parting, Bion asked, does Paek Gon want to learn a way so that no one would dare to tell her she is in the sect only because of a relative? Paek Gon of course wanted to know, and then Bion advised her to become stronger, to defeat those who ignored her because of that with power and skills. Paek Gon got worried and said she had no talent. But in response, Bion repeated the words Jin Yul had told her. A genius is one who starts from the basics and achieves success. These words were able to inspire Paek Gon, so she happily suggested Bion come tomorrow to see her off. However, to her surprise, Bion refused and explained that tomorrow was a day off and the only day she could sleep in, so she would not be able to come. But then Paek Gon extended her hand and shyly proposed to meet again in Udan in 4 years. Bion agreed to this condition and firmly shook Paek Gon's hand, thinking, if they really meet again, then it is definitely fate. A year passed since the preparations, and now Bion came to Nagan to take the selection exam. Only her gift for the 6th birthday was the first serial number on the exam, which amused Yuisin very much. But then he ruffled Bion's hair and admitted that he had number 315th, so the first number was a privilege. 15 years later, Nagin reopened its doors for student recruitment, and this year Huashan is going to accept the 28th generation of Jinshan students. Only 30 out of 500 children aged 6 to 13 are selected for the exam. They will become a group of gifted ones, who will be given Taoist names and recorded in the sect's chronicles. They have no restrictions in martial arts, and in the future they can become both the main elders and the head of the sect. This is a completely different level, unlike worldly students whose names are not recorded anywhere, and who have to live on donations. And it is today that the 5-day exam for selecting Jinshan students begins, about the tasks of which Bion unsuccessfully tried to inquire from Yihyun. But then someone behind suddenly declared that the first number is not a privilege, but an injustice. Bion immediately turned at the voice and saw teacher Yichjin, who is the same age as Yikyun and Yisun. In response, Isan smiled and assured that Bion trained hard, so she could manage without privileges. But perhaps with them she could achieve more. Yihyun asked Bion not to feel burdened, but even if she fails, she will still be a child of Huashan. Then in response, Bion smiled and assured that she would definitely pass the exam and return. At this point, Yikyun and Yisun left Bion, but Yichjin for some reason stayed, which made Bion ask, why didn't he leave with everyone else? But when Yichjin said he would be the main recipient, Bion realized with horror that she definitely would not see inflated scores now. And since the remaining 499 students had not yet arrived, Yichjin assigned Bion to write ordinal numbers for all of them. Well, as soon as the required number of participants finally gathered, the Nagin gates closed, marking the start of the exam. Perhaps since her appearance in this world, Bion saw so many peers in one place for the first time. But then a mentor named Dosan came out to the participants and ordered everyone to gather, as he was about to explain the essence of the exam. It just so happened that Dosan was Yikyun's teacher and constantly complained that Bion was taking his time, so he hated her so much that he started calling her simply that. Meanwhile, Dosan explained to the participants that from now on they would all be called by their ordinal numbers, and then announced the schedule. It did not differ much from Bion's usual days since Yikyun always woke her at dawn. Then Dosan announced that all the examinees would live here until the selection was over, so they had to split into rooms of 8 people each. Bion had already seen these rooms, but they seemed too narrow for 8 people, so she asked, wouldn't it be too cramped for all of them? However, in response, Dosan said to Bion with a sinister look not to worry, because in a few days it would become much freer here. No more questions arose, and then Dosan ordered the examinees to take their rooms and added that since today was the first day of selection, they would have a day off. The next morning, Bion woke up on pure reflexes. She used to constantly complain about having to wake up before sunrise, but now it turned out to be just right. Including Bion, only 4 test subjects woke up from the sound of the drum. There was no point in waking those who did not wake up, as that is the essence of the selection. Those who could not wake up will be sent home. Those who did manage to wake up were already awaited by Yichjin with a stack of empty flasks. He ordered the test subjects to take the flask with their serial number, and warned that drinking water is only available in the valley beyond the rocks, and all other water is unsuitable for drinking. Then Yichjin ordered the test subjects to go fill their flasks with water for training, but they only have 15 minutes for this. In the next moment, all the test subjects rushed together to unpack the flasks, and Yichjin added at the end that those who managed to bring water must immediately start running on the training ground. Now Bion understood why the followers in Huashan still remember this selection, and now she too would tell about it until old age. After the exam on basic physical abilities, it was time for lunch, but Bion could not even move a finger. If she did not have physical training, thanks to Isan, she would have already been excluded, and some test subjects even lost consciousness during the run. After lunch, Dosan gathered the remaining test subjects to explain the essence of the first trial, and it consisted of climbing to the top of Mount Changhaban and returning before the sun completely set. Bion was surprised, as the test turned out to be easier than she thought. However, she was wary of the sly smile on Yichjin's face. Meanwhile, Dosan gave the start signal and all the test subjects, except Bion, immediately rushed to the summit. Bion, however, did not intend to use all her strength at the very beginning, especially since they were given enough time. But there was something suspicious about this test. Even the morning training was harder. Suddenly, a boy screamed in panic that they had a problem and needed to climb faster. It was as if a wild boar was chasing them, which made Bion turn around in fear. There she found, to her surprise, that the sun had almost set. Then Bion realized that Dosan and Yichjin could not have arranged the test as a simple mountain hike. Bion ran with all her might to the summit, wondering as she ran, had she lost track of time, or was there really something wrong with the sun? When Bion finally reached the summit, there was almost no time left for the return journey. At the mountain summit, one of the examiners awaited the test subjects, handed Bion a sheet of paper with a drawn hieroglyph, and said that if she descended with it, she would pass the test. Bion looked at the hieroglyph, but it turned out to be the name of the peak Changhabon. And then Bion remembered the leader's words that the name of each Huashan peak has a meaning. Changhabon means the path of the long dawn. In other words, it is a place where the sun sets quickly, and the sunset lasts long. Then Bion understood the true essence of the trial. If the examinee knows the meaning of the peak, then instead of descending quickly, he must properly distribute his strength. And if he hurries, he will get tired and won't make it in time. As a result, Bion was the only one who descended from the peak on time without losing all her strength along the way. Dosen was genuinely surprised by this and nevertheless announced that number 1 took first place. On the second day of selection, 4 examinees were excluded from Bion's room, so there really was more space. On this occasion, one of the girls suggested that everyone get acquainted and introduced herself as Baek So-young. The second girl happily introduced herself as Son Lily, and then Bion introduced herself as well. But the fourth neighbor, instead of greeting, lay down to sleep, and only grumbled that introductions were pointless since no one knows who will pass further and who will be excluded. However, Bion did not give up so easily, and asked the girl, wouldn't she regret the missed friendship when they all meet again? After these words, she paused for a moment, and then wearily said that her name was Chu Irion. Then Bion asked her age, to which Irion muttered 9, and declared that she was going to sleep, so no more questions. The next day, Baek So-young was absent because she overslept, and thus the third day of the exam began. And unfortunately, it was only getting harder. Now during the morning run, the examinees had to run with sandbags. However, Bion had already gone through similar training, which made the other examinees curious. Why was she so fast, and was she from a family of warriors? Bion noticed that the other students were gradually adapting, but Irion still couldn't manage anything. She distanced herself from the other examinees and relied only on the strength of her spirit. Then a boy asked, why was Irion so strange, since if she failed, she could retake the exam next year? To which Bion suggested that Irion had a reason to try so hard. But then Lily also asked, would Irion be able to pass the exam at all, considering her weak physical condition? In the novels that Bion read, there were always people like Irion, but people who judged others behind their backs, like Lily, were doomed to fail. Perhaps Bion was not aware of all of Irion's circumstances, but she did not consider her that bad. But not even 10 minutes passed before a small incident occurred. Someone took Bion's flask without asking and drank all the water. To fill the flask, one must pass through a rocky cliff to the valley, which takes a lot of strength and time. But some shameless person decided to save their own strength and at the same time make others run around. And the time for rest was already running out, so it was too late to go for water. And besides, Bion would hardly have shared if she had asked. However, contrary to her expectations, Lily suddenly offered her flask and said that water should be used more sparingly. But Bion did not want to remain indebted to her, so she refused the help and declared that she would find the culprit herself. However, Lily turned out to be very persistent, and assured that Bion could drink from her flask as much as she wanted. Such altruism seemed suspicious to Bion, since earlier Lily herself advised to conserve water. Yet this time she accepted the flask. Then Lily told how she saw that it was Irion who drank all the water without asking. Despite this, Bion doubted that Irion was capable of such a thing, but Lily stated that in this way she could eliminate a rival. After all, to pass the exam, one must be among the top 30, but there are no rules preventing the elimination of competitors. There will always be those who are ready to walk over others. There will always be people who will grab another's leg without hesitation to achieve success. Irion was not like such a person, but Bion could not trust a child she had known for only a few days. And so at night, Bion decided to ask Irion directly, did she drink all the water from her flask? But in response, Irion only grumbled angrily that Bion was suspecting the wrong person. Irion said nothing more, and when Bion was about to continue the interrogation, she suddenly had a sharp stomachache. Because of this, even Lily woke up, who asked Irion to be quieter and kinder to the sick person. Then she suggested everyone go to sleep since there was an exam tomorrow, but Bion was more worried now about the thought. Could she have eaten something wrong at lunch? As Lily said, the next day the test subjects faced the second trial. Only Bion could not have expected that they would have to climb the sheer Huashan cliff. Of course, the mentors watched over the test subjects, ready at any moment to support or lower a student to the ground. 11 people gave up immediately at the foot of the cliff. Another 37 gave up halfway and were lowered by the mentor's hands. Fortunately, Bion had been training from an early age, so she was the first to climb the cliff. Irion was also managing, and surprisingly, she was the only one who climbed as high. Therefore, Bion became curious. Why was Irion in such a hurry if only the first 100 people would pass the trial? In response, Irion snapped back and told not to meddle in matters that are not one's own. But the next moment her foot slipped off the ledge. Only in the last second did Irion manage to avoid death by grabbing the edge of the cliff. Bion was about to call for the mentor's help, but Irion told her not to do that. Then Bion got angry and shouted at Irion to stop being so stubborn. But in response, she declared that she didn't care whether she died here. The main thing was not to return to that cursed place. Bion did not know about Irion's past, but judging by her look, she realized she was very wrong when she tried to compare her own determination with hers. Bion's determination is built on love for the people important to her, and Irion's determination comes from all-consuming loneliness. But in any case, Bion understood that she could not overcome Irion's stubbornness, so she decided to help her with advice. Bion told Irion to place her foot a little to the left and a little higher than it was now. Irion clearly did not expect help, but she no longer insisted on being stubborn. As a result, because of Irion's help, Bion lost the advantage and reached the 30-second peak, although it was slightly above the average result. But no additional points were given for helping a comrade to Bion. Nevertheless, Yitjin praised her for an act worthy of a Huashan warrior. However, the relationship with Irion did not improve because of this act. She thanked Bion for the help, but then threatened her not to dare ask about her past. The next day, the third trial began, the essence of which was climbing the same rock, but now with a sack of sand in addition. Bion knew that even during the second trial, the mentors were always ready, so the contestants would not have died even in case of a fall. However, the trial itself was incredibly difficult. Nevertheless, after overcoming all difficulties, Bion successfully passed the third trial and this time came first. Irion also passed the trial without problems. However, the exam was coming to an end, and the eliminated and those who passed were separated by only a few seconds. Finally catching her breath, Bion was about to quench her thirst, but Irion suddenly advised her not to drink from the flask. Bion asked why, and then Irion revealed that the boy with number 143 had poured dirt into the flask and shaken it well. Then in response, Bion swore with a sinister look that she would beat that scoundrel so badly that he would have to be carried out of here. Only she did not know what this 143rd looked like. Fortunately, Irion hinted to her that it was a boy with narrow eyes, short hair, and dark skin. Then Bion asked in surprise if Irion really remembered the numbers of all the contestants, to which she replied that only the numbers of 50 people. Bion was even more surprised, as she thought that Irion did not pay attention to others at all. But in response, she advised not to trust people too much, because there are far more who smile to your face and then stab you in the back than Bion thinks. Then Bion asked who among the remaining ones was capable of that. But Irion answered the question with a sarcastic question. Maybe Bion also wants to be fed with a spoon? Nevertheless, Bion was glad that Irion was not that kind of person, because she never smiled to your face or tried to please her. And as for the 143rd, Bion thoroughly beat him for his meanness, and then she dragged him to Doson so that he would confess everything to the examiner himself. Doson, of course, was not happy about the beating, but Bion knew that fights did not lead to exclusion from the selection. There was no point in punishing the boy anymore, so Doson let him go on his way. However, then Bion said that recently her stomach constantly hurt, and she was the only one whose stomach hurt. Doson suggested that Bion might have eaten something wrong, but she said that she ate several non-poisonous berries that other test subjects also ate. Then Doson decided that the girl's body simply rejected these berries, to which Bion objected. However, in response, Doson reminded her that now Bion was not under Huashan's management, where every complaint is considered. Nevertheless, he still entrusted the newcomer mentor to investigate this case. The dissatisfied Bion was about to head to her room, but on the way she encountered a boy with the number 500. He arrived in Nagant last, together with his twin brother, but unfortunately, by that time there was only enough space for one of the brothers. Meanwhile, the 500th told Bion to go to the training ground, and before she could ask anything, the boy immediately left. Because of this, Bion assumed that everyone who envied her decided to gather together to beat her up. Therefore, she did not go to the ground alone, but called Yuijin with her. Only that one complained all the way that he was distracted from preparing for tomorrow's training, and also threatened to deduct a point if no one was on the ground. Bion herself had already begun to regret this adventure, but just in case they decided to hide in the bushes. And soon, Lily appeared on the training ground together with the 143rd. Bion immediately perked up and declared that these two were clearly plotting conspiracies, but to Yuijin they did not seem like conspirators. However, in the next moment the boy began to shout at Lily and accuse her of lying, since she promised that Bion would be expelled within 2 days, but now he himself might be expelled. But in response, Lily just waved it off and said that it was all because Bion drank very little. Then Bion remembered that whenever her flask was empty, Lily always offered her water. Meanwhile, Yichjin came out of the ambush to the two conspirators and demanded explanations from them with a very grim look. The boy panicked and immediately blamed Lily for everything, claiming that she was the one who suggested uniting against Bion and that she was the one who gave her poisoned water. In response, Lily assured that it was not poison, but in the end, she had no choice but to confess everything. The water she gave Bion was mixed with the juice of the stem of some plant. Fortunately, it is not poisonous and does not cause serious health problems, but if you add berries, which Bion ate for dinner, their combination acts as a laxative. In any case, Lily planned everything well, taking into account Bion's lifestyle features. However, in the end, both she and the 143rd were excluded from the exam. After the poisoning case was revealed, Bion and the ashamed Lily returned to their room. By that time, Irion had already gone to bed, and then Bion asked why Lily wanted to make them quarrel, to which she admitted that she did not want to, and that Irion told the whole truth. Bion was amazed by what she heard, because it turned out that Irion knew something was wrong with her water, and still did not tell her anything. However, this did not answer the main question. Why did Lily act so meanly? Then in response, she tearfully declared that no matter what, she had to pass the exam because she was the first child in a family where the parent constantly gave birth to new ones. However, at her words, Irion suddenly snorted and said that the Lily family must have a lot of food since they can feed so many hungry mouths. And then she got out of bed and asked, "What is so terrible about having a place to return to?" Lily once said that if she failed the exam, she would have to inherit the family business, and perhaps the reason for her action was despair. Therefore, Bion did not get angry and only said that every person has their own story, but first Lily should apologize to her. In response, Lily apologized and asked, "Are you sure that juice did not harm Bion?" But she, with a mischievous smile, assured that she was fine, and reminded that in a month there would also be an exam in Cheonam, so Lily could try her luck there. At that, all three went to sleep, and that was the last night they lived in the same room. The next day, Lily had to leave Nagin, but before leaving, she wished Bion good luck and suggested they greet each other if they met again. Bion was confident that Lily could pass the exam in Cheonam, and did not consider her a bad person. However, at farewell, she thanked Lily for the support and hit her once. In fact, Bion thought about it all night, but came to the conclusion that she could not forgive Lily so easily. Now Bion had no grudges left, but just in case Lily advised her not to take anything from just anyone. However, Bion still had one unresolved question for the boy with the number 500. When Lily left, Bion asked him directly, why did he help her? The boy's name was Biwan, and to that question he shyly admitted that he knew about the deed of 143rd, but pretended not to notice it. Biwan hoped that Bion would be excluded, so he did not tell everything at once. However, then the boy still told everything, and Bion wanted to know, why did he change his mind? Then in response, Bihuan admitted that he could not tell his brother that he passed the exam by ignoring the meanness of others. However, in that case, Bion clarified, would Bihuan help her if both brothers participated in the exam? But in response, Bihuan stated that if his brother found out about this, he would beg to help Bion. Bion was surprised that Bihuan looked up to his brother so much, but anyway, she thanked him, and then added that she would be even more grateful if Bihuan told everything at once, to which he noted that her words did not really sound like gratitude. Today's training was different from the previous ones, since from this day all the examinees would have to carry wooden swords with them. Bion did not think that any of them could handle a sword as well as she could, but it seemed many could at least hold it properly to some extent, which could not be said about the clumsy Irion. Sword movements can only be learned through physical strength, so the mind helps little here. But Irion could make the impossible possible through analysis and logic. She imitated sword movements simply by observing those around her. However, when night came, Irion tried to sneak out of the room, which did not escape Bion's notice. She knew where Irion was headed, but still advised her to rest, otherwise tomorrow she wouldn't be able to lift her sword. However, in response, Irion declared that she was the only one who had never held a sword in her hands. But the main thing, the sword was given to all of them not to fight each other or to learn techniques. The mentors will select only those who have talent. Therefore, Irion must definitely become a disciple of Jin Shan. However, Bion still did not understand. Why exactly Jin Shan, since in a month there will be an exam in Cheonan and Irion could become an ordinary student. But then in response, Irion finally admitted that she would not have a next time because she had run away from a brothel. Running away from there was easy, but that also means catching her would be easy. It was then that Bion understood what would happen to Irion if she failed the exam and left Huashan. And Irion herself declared that instead of returning and following in her sister's footsteps, she would rather die. That is why she needs Huashan's protection, to live her own life. However, Irion does not need anyone else's sympathy or interference. Bion thought their determination was similar, but at least she had a place to return to. Now Bion felt ashamed of her thoughts. That is why she decided she would not allow Irion to be expelled. Then Irion asked, is Bion doing this out of pity for her? However, in response, Bion firmly stated that Huashan does not abandon those who need help. And then, with a kind smile, she added that she had lived under Huashan's protection all her life and wants to give the same to others. Irion decided to believe her words, and for the first time in a long while sincerely smiled back. Thus, a week passed since the beginning of the exam, and as a result, all 30 students were selected. Dosun gathered all the examinees on the training ground and began announcing the numbers of those who passed the exam, and the first one he named was Bion with the first number. Then they named the 500th number, which belonged to Bihuan, and the very last on the list turned out to be the number Irion. With this, the 28th generation of Jinshan students was officially determined, and finally Dosun wished that it would become the future Huashan. As a sign of breaking ties with the outside world, all 30 students will receive Taoist names, which will be recorded in the sect's chronicle. Also, Dosun had to announce the name of the senior student of the 28th generation, and to everyone's surprise, it was Bion. The thing is, the order of seniority is determined by the order of entry, or by age and grades. Therefore, at 6 years old, Bion should have been the youngest. But by the order of entry into Huashan, she is the very first, because in early childhood the head granted her a Taoist name, so now Bion is among the elite. However, one of the students disagreed with this decision, and declared that he would not obey a 6-year-old. Bion was already about to enter into an argument, but Biwan and Irion suddenly took her side. They stated that not respecting the one who joined the sect first and received the highest score was foolishness, which made the boy quickly take back his words. After that, Bion asked the other students, were there any more dissatisfied? Then one boy declared that he was not yet ready to acknowledge Bion, and another defiantly asked, what could she possibly do to them? But Bion answered the question with her fists, and then warned that if anyone had further objections, they should definitely come to her. Of course, no one else raised objections, and from that day Bion was recognized as the senior disciple of Jinshan. Thus, the entrance exams were successfully completed, and a year later Bion and the other students were able to return to Huashan. The first to greet Bion after a year of separation was Uison, who smiled and asked if she had become stronger over the year. In response, Bion revealed that she had practiced 6 harmony techniques all year and constantly trained in everything, from basic martial arts to the initial techniques of Huashan. Then one of the followers asked, is it true that Bion became the senior disciple? In response, she proudly confirmed the rumors and was very happy that after a whole year of numerous disputes and fights, she was finally recognized. But then came the time for the long-awaited reunion with Uihyun, which Bion had been waiting for all year. Only she had one piece of news reserved for him and for Uison. The thing is, students of Jinshan are assigned a teacher. Usually the teacher chooses a student for themselves, but since Bion grew up here, her case is special. She could choose a teacher herself from those who had already taught her. But Bion didn't think about it for long because from the very beginning she studied under Uihyun. Uison, however, saw this news as a betrayal and reminded how many years he had spent teaching her. However, in response, Bion also reminded him that a teacher is like a parent, and of the two of them, it was Uihyun who had raised her all this time. Be that as it may, now Bion became an official student of Huashan, and therefore, following traditions, she respectfully asked Uihyun to become her teacher. He agreed without hesitation and even got emotional realizing how quickly time had flown. Only now Bion had to live in the dormitory with the other students, not as before with Uihyun. That dormitory was located a bit far from the place where Bion used to live. But for Biwan, the dormitory building reminded him of the one where they all trained for the exam, and even the rooms inside turned out to be almost the same, only there was more space. In one of them, Bion saw Irion, but now as a student of Jinshan, she was called Birin. Everything was changing and seemed so unusual, but now Bion truly felt that she had become a real part of Huashan. After settling into the dormitory, Bion visited the head to pay respects as an official disciple of Huashan. In response, the head gently stroked her head and said that from a child who worried that she would not be able to bloom the plum flower, Bion had grown into a warrior worthy of her Taoist name. Bion understood that just as she herself was growing up quickly, time around her was not standing still. Elder Mu Jin, who wanted to make Bion a genius swordsman of Huashan, ascended to the heavens in the year she was training in Jinshan. Moreover, the time had come when the head would have to accept new disciples, after which he would move to a higher position. And that means the master of this place will change. And with the change of generations, there are more and more people one has to say goodbye to. For Bion, the head's office had been a playroom since childhood, and now she was left only with precious memories that she would never encounter again in reality. She understood the inevitability of this, but even so, it did not make her heart any lighter. Meanwhile, the head suggested that Bion take a little walk through the plum orchard. There, Bion could not hold back, and with tears in her eyes began to beg the head to use his techniques to regain his youth and live many, many more years. But in response, the head said that for a true warrior, eternal life is only a dream. And since he had heard kind parting words from Bion, he decided to tell her something that would help her bloom the plum flowers. Bion was ready to listen to every word of his, and then the leader revealed that only enlightened people can truly attain the complete Tao. Therefore, he asked Bion never to forget this. The next day, the 28th generation of Jinshan disciples came under the personal guidance of Yui Hyun. The oldest among the disciples was 11 years old, and the highest in rank, that is Bion, was 7. From the point of view of a 13-year-old teenager, that was enough to treat her with disdain. But since there are ranks, punishment would follow any attacks. However, Bion always believed that if the disciples start a quarrel first, the best solution would be to shift all responsibility onto them. Therefore, with a sinister look, she suggested simply beating whoever would start to pick fights and ignore the Jinshan disciples. But no such person was found, which made Bion start to resent, and Bihuan asked, "Isn't it good that everything is calm?" In response, Bion declared that she was bored, to which Bihuan advised her to engage in training. But Bion was already tired of training, so she suggested arranging sparring with other disciples. Fortunately for Bihuan, his twin brother called him, who had a short break in training. However, instead of a warm greeting after a year apart, Bihuan ordered his brother to call him elder. To the brother, this seemed strange, but he was not offended, and then suddenly asked, "Is it true that among the students of Jinshan there is a female student who was admitted because of connections?" At this question, all the students of Jinshan were horrified, because this fool had just said a forbidden phrase. Meanwhile, Bion also asked, where did he hear about this? In response, Bihuan's brother said that these were just rumors, but Bion demanded to be given the source, the one who first spread these rumors. However, the next moment she heard some noise and shouts at the training ground. Then Bion saw Biren, armed with a wooden sword and surrounded by beaten students of Huashan. Bion and Biwan immediately rushed to her aid, and one of the students pointed at Biren and declared that she was the very girl with connections. Then Biren raised her sword and swore that even if she was weaker than her comrades, she would not lose to such cowards attacking in a crowd. However, in response, the boy swung his sword and shouted that if Biren were really that strong, she would have defeated him with one strike. But at that very second, Bion kicked the scoundrel with a running start and declared that he would never defeat the outstanding talent Biren. Then Bion found a familiar face among the students, a girl who had gone through the selection for Jinshan together with her. She was eliminated from the exam, not making it into the top 30, and therefore surely started spreading rumors. Only the girl confused Bion with Biren. Meanwhile, the student began to claim that she had never said anything like that. And then some boy, significantly taller and older than Bion, approached her and asked with a haughty look, was the exam really so easy that even such riffraff could pass it? However, before answering, Bion punched the insolent boy hard in the stomach. And when he fell to his knees, Bion triumphantly declared that they were senior students, and therefore they should be respected and greeted, even just by noticing their shadow. Then Bion commanded, "Hit them!" And at that very moment the students of Jinshan clashed with the students of Huashan. Of course, the news of this fight reached the adults. They quickly found out who started the fight first, and since the students of Jinshan were recognized as the victims, they were not scolded much. It also turned out who exactly spread the rumors that caused the fight. It was one of the boys involved in the brawl, who was brought by Bihuan. He immediately began to insist that he was not the source of the rumors, and had heard them from someone else. However, Bihuan said the opposite, which made Bion slyly ask, whom should she believe? Then the boy finally gave in, and revealed that the real source of the rumors was a disciple, Yusonso. At the mention of this name, Bion clenched her fists in a tremor and regretted that she had broken only one finger of his that time. She thought she had taught Yusonso a good lesson, but Bion did not even suspect that he was still angry with her. Bion told everything to Yixin, who in response ordered her not to get involved in fights over stupid rumors anymore. But then Bion angrily declared that because of these stupid rumors, Biren almost got into trouble, and therefore she could not ignore them. Bion hoped to shift the responsibility of solving this problem onto Yixin's shoulders, but she did not foresee that their conversation could be overheard by Yikyon. The response followed immediately, and after a few minutes Yusinso appeared before a very angry Yikyon, confessing. Earlier, Yusinso had already been locked in the Hall of Repentance for several days. Now he had to repeat a similar feat. But Bion sincerely hoped that this scoundrel would be thrown out of Huashan, Several days passed after this incident, and now the time had come when a meeting of the Murim Association was to take place in Huashan. A group of the strongest warriors, who usually compete with each other, would gather together to make decisions that would help get out of the crisis. But on this very day, Bion and her group were assigned to sweep the temple grounds. By the way, Biren noticed that for 2 years, Murim warriors have been arguing about where the association's headquarters would be located, and one of the students heard that shortly before the exam some kind of incident happened. Bion knew that the incident referred to the case when she beat Baek Yul and accidentally gave wine to Baek Gon, so she ordered the student to work silently. But suddenly a boy from another sect approached the Bion group and asked, where should he go to meet the 3rd generation of disciples? Only Bion immediately recognized Sehon in him, who 4 years ago stole her favorite hair tie. And therefore she, barely restraining her anger, answered that they are the very 3rd generation. Sehon was surprised as he took the disciples for servants and without any ill intent asked, why then do they just sweep the yard? At such a question, Bion was ready to break the broom over the boy. But he suddenly became interested in Bihuan and asked, isn't he the strongest here? In response, Bihuan immediately pointed to Bion and declared that there was no one stronger than her among them. Then Sehon borrowed a steel sword from his companion named Yoon and suddenly threw it at Bion. But as soon as she caught the sword, at that very second Sehon attacked. Bion barely managed to block the strike and was struck by Sehon's impatience. But the problem was different. Bion was losing to him in brute strength. And also Sehon parried each of her attacks too easily. The weight of a real sword was unfamiliar to Bion. She remembered the basics of the techniques well, but in practice she did poorly. Everything got tangled in his head, and finally, for the first time, the sword slipped out of Bion's hand. She took up the sword before she learned to walk and was 5 steps ahead of the others at the exam. But now, she lost a fight for the first time. Meanwhile, Sekon sheathed his sword and stated that he expected much more from Huashan. But there is nothing special here either. These words sobered Bion, and she demanded Sehon to repeat what he had just said. And in the next moment, Bion fiercely struck Sekon in the face and declared that since he had defeated the Huashan sword, he should now try to handle fists. Yoon from Bihuan tried to intervene, but Bion was already uncontrollable. She began beating the fallen Sekon and kept saying that he must not dare insult Huashan. However, the next moment some girl approached her and suddenly asked Sekon, what is he doing? In response, Sehon burst into tears and complained about Bion, addressing the girl as his older sister. However, she decided that Sekon was just playing with new friends, so she did not interfere. As soon as the girl left, Bion lost all desire to continue the fight, and so she ordered Sehon to leave, and asked Biren to escort him to the guest house. The next day, the news of the fight reached the ears of the leader, and as expected, he summoned Bion and Sehon to the Yonhua Hall. Yesterday, Yuihyun suspected nothing, so Bion concluded that it was the Namgun family who complained to the leader. Only 2 were guilty in the fight, but for some reason only Bion was made to stand on her head as punishment, which only made her hate Sehon even more. Meanwhile, his father, Namgun Kichjin, declared that he could not just let this incident go. Bion knew that the new leader of Huashan was a good person, but she was worried that unlike the previous one, he was more strict than kind. The new leader agreed with Kichjin, but he was surprised that Bion remained silent and said nothing in her defense. Yuihyun was also troubled by this, so he asked Bion, was she really going to stand like that all day? But Bion could not open her mouth. She could not admit that her defeat had shamed Huashan. Therefore, even if she was sent to the Hall of Repentance, Bion would rather stand like that all day than say something so humiliating before the elders. However, in the next moment, Sehon suddenly stated that he was simply hit in the fight, and besides, he was to blame for saying too much. Bion tried to shut Sehon up, but he still admitted that he was the first to insult the Huashan sword style. In response, the leader sighed heavily and ordered Sehon and Bion to stand up. And then he suggested resolving the situation with a simple reconciliation, to which Bion and Sehon shook hands and apologized to each other. After that, Yuihyun escorted Bion to the dormitory, and they both remained silent the entire way. Only at the very entrance did Yuihyun ask Bion to tell him what really happened. In response, she clenched her fists and said in a trembling voice that she could endure mockery of her weakness. However, he could not allow anyone to mock the sword of Huashan. Then Yuihyun embraced her and said that losing did not mean the Huashan sword was weak, since Bion had just begun learning and had not mastered even a small part of the techniques. From these kind words, Bion finally let her tears flow and vowed to Yuihyun that next time she would definitely win. After crying and venting, Bion felt much better, so she decided to visit her secret place in the plum orchard to enjoy the sunset. However, when Bion was already about to return, she suddenly noticed a stranger in the garden. It turned out to be a girl of extraordinary beauty, with snow-white hair and scarlet eyes. Bion was amazed by her beauty. and also by the fact that it was the first time in this world she had met an albino. However, this did not cancel the fact that the girl was not allowed to be in the garden, so Bion ordered her to leave. But in response, she declared that she could go wherever she wished. Then Bion reminded the violator that even the daughter of His Majesty the Emperor must obey prohibitions. In response, she introduced herself as Feng Haran, and with a smile explained that she simply wanted to see as much as possible during her allotted time. Bion understood that the girl had little time left, but she was surprised that she spoke about it so calmly. Also, albinism is not an incurable disease, so Bion asked, "What exactly is Feng ill with?" But to the question, she answered with a question. Does Bion know what the disease of energy flows is? Bion had indeed heard of this disease, which is caused by a congenital excess of yin energy, which shortens lifespan. Despite the short life, such people possess extraordinary talent and appearance. It is also rumored that the disease can be cured if one absorbs the energy of a spiritual animal, but finding it is harder than plucking a star from the sky. Because of this, Feng's family is overly protective and does not even allow her to take a step without accompaniment, so no one knows that she is currently in the garden. Once, Bion dreamed of this, to have a prestigious and caring family, like in the novel The Precious Daughter of the Duke. But now such a life seemed too boring to her, and Feng meanwhile continued and suddenly declared that as a young master, he was lucky to have a good brother and father. From the realization that Feng was a boy, Bion was taken aback, and he calmly admitted that all this excessive care served as a constant reminder that he did not have long to live. However, despite this, Bion told Feng that he could not come here whenever he wanted. Therefore, she advised Feng to visit Huashan next time during the plum blossom season, so that Bion could officially show him everything here. Feng was surprised by the offer and asked, could he really come here again? In response, Bion assured him that during the blossom season, this garden was more beautiful than any landscape. Then Feng smiled and suddenly declared that he liked Bion, and when she asked why, Feng explained that Bion was the first to promise him something in the future. But then Feng complained that it annoyed him when people fussed over him, and even young Master Seihan was cautious with him. Be that as it may, it was time to return to the temple. However, halfway through the journey, Fen's older brother suddenly appeared, who immediately grabbed him in a hug. Barely holding back tears, the older brother hugged Fen tightly and asked sternly, how could he go so far alone with such a weak body? And noticing Bion, the older brother decided that she had tricked the naive and trusting Fen into coming here. But he assured that he left on his own and met her by chance. And at farewell, Fen asked Bion to remember his name. After that, Bion headed to the dormitory, and on the way thought that Fen was not made for Murim, and was unlucky to be born in this world. At the dormitory, the other students greeted Bion with relief, but Biren was not worried at all because she knew that Bion was not the type to cry in a corner. However, in response, she stated that only the last nerve cell was holding her back from wanting to smash everything around, so Bion decided to go to bed earlier. The defeat itself did not upset her much, but after talking with Yi Hyun, the bitterness of the first defeat in her life was felt much stronger. Then Biren told Bion that losing is not always bad. Until now, Bion had always won, so she did not understand what the poison of defeat was. Therefore, this time Bion must try to find the answer in defeat, and if it does not work out, she should not be ashamed to ask others for help. Bion thought over Biren's words until she fell asleep, but the next day she still did not understand their meaning. Therefore, Bion decided to walk around the temple courtyard to clear her head. But as bad luck would have it, she suddenly met Sekon. Bion did not say a word to him, but simply turned in the opposite direction. But then Sekon called her foolish, which made Bion immediately grab the impudent fellow by the collar and remind him that someone was asked to watch their words yesterday. However, in response, Sekon smirked and said that he knew Bion would react that way. She knew that if she started a fight again, she would be locked up in the Temple of Repentance, so Bion let Sekon go and told him to get out of sight. However, just as she was about to leave, Sekon desperately asked her to stay. Then Bion slyly asked if Sekon had gotten lost again. However, in response, he blushed and admitted that he just wanted to apologize properly. Sekon admitted that he should not have spoken that way about Huashan and asked for forgiveness. Bion knew that the elders had made Sekon apologize yesterday, but now he was speaking sincerely, and therefore she decided to give him one last chance and asked, what was he even thinking when he said that to a Huashan disciple? But then Seon enthusiastically replied that he was just glad to have a good sparring match, and for the first time in a long while he fought with someone for more than 30 seconds. Bion was forced to admit that she understood Seon, since a lot of time had passed since she had sparred with a worthy opponent. Instead of boredom and loneliness at that moment, she felt a thrill and excitement. But because of humiliation and defeat, Bion simply did not want to admit it. and so she decided to forgive Sehon and said that Murim is not a place where people immediately draw their swords after one word. However, right after that, Bion warned that she was a bit malicious, and therefore she would escort Sehon to the guest house only if he knelt and admitted that the Huashan sword is the best. But in response, Sehon said that he knew the way, and also that he wanted to ask Bion one question. In the past, Sehon had already been to Huashan, but when he got lost, a girl showed him the way, and so Sehon wanted to know, is she still studying at Huashan? In response, Bion proudly declared that it was her, but Sehon objected and said that Bion did not look like her at all. Sehon guessed that the girl had already left Huashan, which made him sad, but Bion got very angry at him. But then Bion noticed on Sehon's wrist her hair tie that he had stolen 4 years ago, and so she immediately grabbed Sehon's hand and demanded her treasure back. In response, Sehon said it was a gift, but Bion reminded him that 4 years ago he had brazenly stolen that hair tie. At these words, Sehon was stunned, for that girl had been beautiful, fragile, and kind. But now she had turned into a bold girl with a bad temper. Bion wanted to hit Sehon, but restrained herself and reminded him how he himself had invited her to his home, but she had refused. After that, Sehon was finally convinced that it really was Bion, and barely holding back tears of emotion, he said that he had finally found her. Only then did he come to the conclusion that Bion had a very hard time in Huashan. Otherwise, how else to explain her so changed character? In response, Bion slapped Sehon on the forehead and angrily asked, could it be that in 4 years nothing changed in him except his height? But Sehon did not answer and was not even offended by the slap. He simply wearily leaned against the wall and slid down to the ground. Bion sat down next to him and asked what was wrong with him, to which Sehon sadly admitted that her refusal was the right decision. In Huashan, it does not matter if you are an orphan, but in Namgun Bion would have had problems because of that. At Sehon's home there are friends to play with. Many of them are children of other influential families, but they are always cautious towards him. Once, Sehon had a serious sparring match with one of them. In the end, they both got injured, but the boy's parents made him apologize to the Namgun family. And here in Huashan, during quarrels, both offenders are scolded, so Sehon was glad that Bion stayed. These words struck Bion, and she also realized that those children at least had parents. But in her case, everything would have been much worse. Therefore, she calmed Sehon and said that it was her choice to stay in Huashan. However, Sehon objected and said that he simply let Bion go, otherwise he would have ignored the adults and just taken her with him. But then Bion picked up a fallen leaf and said that in the world there would still be things that Sehon would not get, no matter how hard he tried. Then she stood up and declared that the warriors of Huashan would not give her up just because of Sehon's whim, because they were her family. And considering that now Bion had become an official disciple of Huashan, Sehon definitely would get nothing. But in response he said that it was a dubious honor, since Namgun was much better even than Wudang. In the end, Bion and Sehon fought again, but this time they were separated by the arriving Isan. However, he did not miss the opportunity to sarcastically remind them that the leader had just reconciled them. Also, Isan reminded that Bion and Sehon used to kiss, which made her instantly blush and order not to talk about someone else's dark past. Isan was not going to scold the children, but simply hurried them to the dining hall, as it was already time for dinner. But in the next moment, Fen's older brother appeared on their path and strictly asked Bion, "What is her name?" It turned out that Fen was very upset because he did not learn Bion's name, although he did not look upset at all. Isan was surprised and asked if Fen's brother had come here only for this reason, to which he declared that because of this reason Fen could not eat. Although Bion really did not say her name, she perfectly understood that Fen was simply manipulating his overly caring brother. Meanwhile, Isan told him Bion's name and wanted to ask him to also escort Sehon to the guest house, but Fen's brother immediately rushed away. Such behavior amazed Isan, but Bion calmed him down and said that Sehon knew the way himself. Sehon was indeed already about to leave, but before that he suggested to Bion to fight again at their next meeting. However, then he added with a smirk that he would win again, to which Bion stated that she lost only because she was not used to a real sword. Fortunately, Isan intervened in the emerging dispute, took Bion under his arm, and threatened to leave her without dinner. But she was not going to retreat and swore to Sehon that next time she would make him admit defeat. Then in response, Sehon waved goodbye to Bion and then headed to the guest house. But as soon as he left, Bion belatedly realized that she had not returned her hair tie. And when night came, Bion decided to secretly practice with a real sword, since the wooden one now seemed too light to her. However, soon she was found by Dosan, who advised not to overdo it, otherwise it would negatively affect the body. Bion was surprised by his appearance, and Dosan meanwhile asked, "Is one defeat really so humiliating for her?" Bion did not know what to say to this question. Then Dosan took the sword from her and stated that the result from effort does not appear immediately. Everything comes gradually. Then he threw his shirt over Bion's shoulders and, taking her in his arms, added that if you overexert yourself, instead of the expected result, you can simply ruin your own body. Then Bion finally admitted that she was just thinking about what lesson she could learn from the defeat. But in response, Dosan pulled his shirt over her head and reminded her that all extraneous thoughts must be cast aside when holding a sword. And Dosan also said that victory gives confidence, and defeat teaches humility. Bion still did not understand the meaning of these words, but Dosan said that she was too worried about finding the answer. But Bion objected, stating that she was simply angry. Then Dosan asked, does Bion remember what those she defeated time and again looked like? As soon as Bion heard the question, she immediately remembered the duel with Sehon. She remembered how she lacked technique and attack power, and even the last strike, which caused her defeat. But then Dosan patted Bion on the head and said that she should not belittle herself, because the feeling of inferiority is a poison that prevents her from seeing her strength and intensifies hatred towards others. After that, Dosan promised that he would not tell the leader anything if Bion went to sleep now. And then in response, Bion thanked him with a smile. The next day became the last day of the association meeting, so Bion knew that all those departing would have to pass through the main gates. There she began to wait for Sehon in order to finally get her hair tie back. Soon he appeared and, running up to Bion, asked why she had called him. Sehon thought that Bion wanted him to accompany her, but she grabbed his hand and demanded the return of the hair tie. In response, Sehon resisted and stated that this hair tie had been with him longer than with Bion, but she did not care. Bion simply tore the hair tie from Sehon's wrist, but at the same moment he pulled a new hair tie from her hair. Before Bion could recover, Sehon proposed an exchange and said that if she wanted to get the new hair tie back, she would have to visit Namgun. Literally trembling with restrained rage, Bion accepted the offer and promised that she would hang Sehon on the hair tie when they got to Namgun. However, in response, Sehon only waved goodbye to Bion cheerfully and said he would wait for her. Bion also wanted to say something to Sehon at the last moment, but she was distracted by Fen sneaking up from behind. He skillfully tied Bion's tangled hair with his shoelace and suddenly asked her to say her name once more. Bion was surprised, since he already knew her name, but Fen explained that he wanted to hear it personally from Bion. She did not consider it that important, but still introduced herself again, for which Fen was very grateful. However, the next moment, one of Fen's older brothers rudely interrupted their conversation. Bion was quite frightened, and the second brother, meanwhile, said she was standing too close to Fen and asked her to keep her distance. However, Fen immediately defended his friend, and told his brothers that because of them, he had no friends anyway. And perhaps in this, Bion fully agreed with Fen. Such behavior from the older brothers was abnormal. But then Fen waved goodbye to her and, despite the brothers' objections, suggested meeting at the next association gathering. Meanwhile, Sehon admired Bion's hair ribbon and in his thoughts rejoiced that he had not come to the Huashan meeting in vain. He wanted to meet his first love again, using the hair ribbon as an excuse. Only the memories turned out to be too embellished, which is why Sehon still wondered, how could Bion have turned from a goddess into a bandit? But now he had a new excuse for a meeting, and he hoped that next time everything would go just as well. However, the next moment, Feng approached Sehon and asked to be given the hair ribbon. Sehon knew that before him was the youngest child from the Hebei family, and even the Namgun clan dared not contradict them. Nevertheless, Sehon was not going to part with the ribbon so easily and asked Feng, why did he need it? But in response, Feng said that Sehon had stolen this ribbon, to which he sharply declared that he would never give it back. Feng was not going to sow discord between the families over such a matter, but no one forbade him from teasing Sehon a little. Therefore, he stated that he would never yield Bion to a fool like Sehon. Sehon became wary and asked, did Feng like Bion? However, in response, Feng explained that if Sehon meant interest in the opposite sex, then no. And then Feng smiled and admitted that next to Bion he was able to catch his breath for the first time. A month after the association meeting, Bion and Yui Hyun went down to the village at the foot of Mount Huashan to buy a real sword for training. Huashan is located to the west of the village Huame, which is why warriors and followers of the sect often come there to buy weapons and other goods. However, recently members of the demonic cult have been acting suspiciously, although their activities are not very noticeable now. Be that as it may, Bion was still excited about her first official visit to the village Huame. And first of all, Yihyun took her to a familiar blacksmith who was engaged in forging weapons for Huashan. The blacksmith was pleasantly surprised by such a quick meeting with Yihyun and asked, could it be that the plum blossom sword made of hanchol has deteriorated so quickly? Hanchol is a special metal used throughout Murim for making swords. Already about a month ago, Yihyun, Yigan, and Yisun became masters of the plum blossom. Masters are appointed from the 5 best fencers, and as a sign of this they receive a sword made of the rare metal hankol. However, Bion's attention was drawn to another sword, thinner and longer than the others. The blacksmith noticed her interested look and explained that it was a soft sword. It is called that because it can bend. Such a sword is good for self-defense, but it is difficult to use as a main weapon, so the blacksmith never recommends it to beginners. Since Bion still lacked training, the blacksmith suggested she choose one of the short blades, and he also advised not to pay attention to the appearance, but to choose the blade that fits best in the hand. Bion listened to the advice and took the first blade that caught her eye. Let her use it only briefly, but Bion approached the choice wisely, because this is the very blade she would use in sparring with Sehon. After a successful purchase, Uihyun suggested getting some food before returning to Hwashan, to which Bion gladly agreed. However, the next moment they both heard a piercing scream from behind, and turning around, Bion and Uihyun saw a wounded girl who was desperately begging for help. Uihyun asked what had happened, but instead of answering, the girl grabbed his hand and begged him to quickly follow her into the alley. Uihyun decided to follow the girl, and told Bion not to go anywhere and wait for him in that spot. Finally, he told Bion that she would be safe there, since this village is located at the foot of Hwashan. Bion thought so too, until Uihyun and the girl disappeared behind the alley. And the next moment, someone completely unnoticed crept up behind Bion and placed a hand on her shoulder. When Bion turned around, a stranger in a mask ordered her in a threatening tone to quietly follow him. At the sight of the man in black, chills ran down Bion's body. Could this really be the people of the demonic cult that Feng Harum had spoken about? Bion assumed that according to common cliches, the demonic cult should have brainwashed her. She was also afraid that she would become a spineless puppet and cause a massacre. Then all those people whom Bion met in this life may perish by her hand. The man in black ordered Bion to follow him silently, but judging by how he threatened with a knife, Bion realized that she would either be tortured or simply killed. To escape and not die in the process would be the best outcome for her. But if escape fails, the best solution for Bion would be to die on the spot so that traces remain. Here a man in black noticed Bion's hesitation and again ordered to follow him if she did not want to die. To which Bion only smirked in response and urged the man in black to attack. If she was destined to die, it was here. Taking a deep breath, Bion pushed the man in black with all her might and loudly called for help. The man in black immediately covered Bion's mouth with his hand. But it was already too late. People in the square heard the scream and paid attention to it. Suddenly Bion heard the teacher's voice and breaking free called for help again. Of course, the member of the demonic cult understood that this was a failure, and the only right decision was to finish Bion on the spot, so he struck Bion's right side with the blade. Yi-hyun was already very close. Bion could not allow the man in black to escape. Even if the member of the demonic cult escaped, Bion had to leave at least some trace so that he could be caught. And, drawing her sword, Bion rushed at the opponent. The lunge was successful. She managed to strike the opponent in the left shoulder, but the man in black did not react at all. Because of the wound, Bion began to lose consciousness. She collapsed to the ground. Through her closing eyelids, she was able to notice that Yi-hyun still managed to arrive on time and engaged in battle. Bion felt dizzy, and a strange taste of fish appeared in her mouth. Could there really have been poison on the knife? Although it was a reliable way to get rid of a person. Of course, no one could have foreseen this, so Bion only hoped that Yi-hyun would not blame himself too much. After all, thanks to all of them, Bion's second life was joyful, so she did not want to leave sadness behind. When Bion opened her eyes, there was only white fog around. Bion did not quite understand where she was, only remembered how she was wounded. She immediately began to examine her side. But to her surprise, there was no wound, and her clothes were clean. Suddenly, through this fog, a strange figure approached Bion. It turned out to be the elder Mujin. He was the first person among those who ascended to the heavens. In life, he cared for Bion. At this, Bion was horrified. Could it be that she had reached the heavens and Mujin had come to guide her across the river of death? Suddenly, Mujin began to say something, but Bion could not hear exactly what. Then a thought crept into Bion's mind. Could this be a demon disguised as Mujin? But all her doubts instantly vanished when Mujin burst out in an angry tirade. How could Bion appear before him without becoming the best sword of Hwashan? Crossing the river of death took only a moment, so Bion urgently needed to come to her senses before her internal energy went out of control. Internal energy can get out of control due to overstrain or shock during training, or due to taking a miraculous medicine. Because of this, a person can die, become a vegetable, or go insane. The problem was not in Bion's injury, but in the spiritual energy she absorbed. But when did she manage to absorb such an amount of spiritual energy? Suddenly, Bion felt a pain in her side. Her breath caught. Her blood seemed to boil inside, and her whole body trembled from an incomprehensible energy. This energy was devouring the poison that was killing her. The problem was that the energy was also devouring Beyond herself along with the poison. Energy and blood mixed, and if Beyond did not stop, he would go insane or die. Energy tried to break through her body, but Beyond could not allow it, for she had a place to return to. Beyond fully concentrated, suddenly she heard many voices of support. Everyone gave advice on how to properly direct energy. Finally, Beyond realized that it was necessary to suppress the bursting energy and direct it into the abdomen. After all, Beyond could not afford to die from that. And more importantly, she did not want the duel with Seihan to end in his favor. When Beyond opened her eyes, she found herself in Huashan Hospital. Around her were the worried faces of her loved ones, whose voices she heard while fighting death. Then Yi Hyun gently brought the cup of water to Beyond's lips, and then carefully wiped the sweat from her forehead. Yi Hyun tightly pressed her to his chest. He already thought he had lost Beyond. Fortunately, they had the medicine Chaso. Beyond's eyes widened in surprise, for the Chaso medicine is a miraculous medicine symbolizing Huashan. It is similar to the medicine of Tekon Wudang, and is given only to those who have made a huge contribution to the sect. Beyond shifted her gaze to the elder Tai San, wondering why they spent such a valuable artifact on an ordinary disciple. Noticing her gaze, Tai San explained that from this moment on, Beyond would have to train and learn to control the remaining energy herself. Of course, Beyond understood that it would be madness to absorb all the energy at once. It should be done gradually, absorbing exactly as much as she needed. Beyond also assumed that now, as payment, she would have to fight all the heads of the demonic cult. Nevertheless, that was a matter for the future. So Beyond sighed with relief and leaned back on the bed. She had still managed to return home. Late that same day, Bu Yin reported to the leader that the criminal they had left in prison was dead. These words greatly surprised the leader, for they had gagged him and cut his tendons so he could not commit suicide. So how did this happen? Then Bu Yin suggested that it was the poisonous bug, which meant it was definitely the work of the demonic cult. They force a person to swallow the poisonous bug, go. The technique allows them to manipulate consciousness and even kill the victim. Then the leader pondered, realizing they were not mistaken, that the demonic cult had begun to behave strangely. Are they really going to break the truce again and gain dominance? It seems the bloody wind will blow again soon. 2 months have passed since the kidnapping attempt, and it seems that Beyond's body has somewhat recovered. Therefore, she actively trained on the playground together with the other junior students. The other students were very happy about Beyond's arrival. Although, of course, the seniors decided to keep it a secret that she had taken Chaso's medicine. And if Beyond absorbs all the remaining energy, he will be able to become a first-class swordmaster, although it could take at best 2 or even 3 years. The adults never told Beyond the reason for the kidnapping, even though she was directly involved. Instead, the students were temporarily forbidden from going down to Huame. But Beyond calmly accepted this ban because an event involving Udan and Huashan was soon to take place. Suddenly, Bifan decided to ask if Beyond had seen how the Day of Enlightenment passed 4 years ago, to which Beyond nodded affirmatively, since it took place in Huashan. Last time Udan came to Huashan, this time it is Huashan's turn to visit. Bifan assumed that Huashan won last time, but last time it was Wudang that had more winners in one-on-one sparring. The third generation of students grumbled about this for a long time. Suddenly, the sneaky Yi Jin tousled Beyond's hair. Could it be that she wants to spoil the fun by telling all the students? Yi Jin became serious again, reminding the young disciples to train diligently, for their skills are the future of the Huashan sect, to which Beyond smiled and reminded that Yi Jin also lost last year. Then Bi Huan interrupted the conversation, asking if they too would participate in sparring. After all, the third-generation students became students a year earlier, so they had more time. But Yi Jin could not understand Bi Huan's depressive mood. Could a person with his abilities be afraid to lose to Wudang? After all, Bi Huan's teacher was Yi Gan, the senior among the Yi generation students. It couldn't be that Yi Gan failed to encourage his student. Then Yi Jin decided to behave as he did during the selection. Perhaps then Bi Huan would regain courage if he went through the hellish training again. Bi Huan froze in horror, recalling the nightmare he had endured, but still found the strength to whisper that they would train harder for victory. Time passed, and now a procession from Huashan headed to Wudang Mountain in Hubei province. Beyond was amazed by the views. Unlike Huashan, the ascent here was much more comfortable. Suddenly, Beyond noticed a pond ahead right in front of the main gates, which she immediately reported to the mentor Yi Gan. It was the Hyokumchi Pond, in honor of the founder of Wudang, Chang Sambon. No one could cross the bridge over the pond with weapons. Bi Huan immediately protested, since they had left their swords behind. But Wudang students do cross the bridge with weapons. Then Beyond suggested also taking weapons with them. But Jin Yul was against it. If they did so, it could drive a wedge between the clans. Bion immediately apologized for her thoughtless action. Nevertheless, Jin Yul warned the students that they must be more cautious in Wudang. While Bion was undergoing selection, Jin Yul became the elder, and although by age she was more suited to be a mentor, thanks to her talent she became the heir of Mo Yen. Jin Yul noticed the unfriendly glances of the Wudang students directed at Bion, so she decided to find out what she had done last time. Of course, Bion clearly remembered how she beat up one student and got another drunk. She was very bothered by the judging looks, so Bion decided to hide behind the broad back of Yi Gan. But to her surprise, that spot was already taken by Bi Huan. Why was the good-natured Bi Huan behaving like that? Finally, Yi Gan noticed the hiding Bi Huan, but they came to Wudong not to hide. So he advised the young students to ask their colleagues to show them around. But Bion did not share his optimism, since children of the same age at that time were more likely to fight than to make friends. One of the Wudong students recognized Bi Huan as the former He Min. He had, of course, heard that He Min joined the Huashan sect, but could not fully believe it. Bion was very surprised by this turn of events, so she asked Bi Huan how he knew the Wudong students. He replied that his family lived in Hubei. Could it be that Bi Huan preferred to overcome himself and pass the hellish selection in Huashan? Bion wanted to believe that not all who failed in Wudang dared to face the hellish selection of Huashan. But now He Min was calling Bi Huan, so there was no point in talking about what had happened. After all, Bi Huan liked it in Huashan. Then Bion found those fox-like eyes familiar. She recognized the boy as Baek Yoon, the very bully she had beaten in childhood. Baek Yoon also recognized his offender and immediately began to mock the fact that even Huashan could not ignore the love for the child they raised. But Bion only smiled in response. Baek Yoon continued to tease others as usual. Perhaps this is normal in Wudang, but such behavior is unacceptable in Huashan. Suddenly, a command to stop immediately was heard, and a fist from an older student landed on Baek Yoon's head. The senior student asked them not to start fights again while he was not around, and noted how much Bion had grown. But she could not recall where she had seen this student before. And then she recognized the senior student. He was the one who had separated them from Baek Yoon last time. The senior student apologized for Baek Yoon's behavior and offered to give a tour of the palace. The procession followed the student from Wudang. Bion followed everyone, closing her eyes. She was very tired after several days of trekking to Wudang. Moreover, when she tried to sleep, the mentor Yigan constantly disturbed her. Therefore, Bion was so exhausted that she did not notice the step ahead and stumbled. Fortunately, someone managed to catch her. The stranger offered to carry her on his back. The voice sounded familiar to Bion. It was difficult to open her eyes, but Bion simply had to look at the stranger. Suddenly, Bi Huan lifted her and threw Bion onto his back. The senior student was a little embarrassed because the guests were so tired from the journey, and he had dragged them so far. But Bi Huan just waved his hand since Bion was the youngest among them. Comfortably settled on Bi Huan's back, Bion mumbled something indistinctly. Bi Huan was extremely outraged that the elder almost climbed onto the back of the first stranger she met. But Baek Gon clearly did not consider herself the first passerby. The greeting had to be postponed, so she suggested going inside quickly. Finally, the day of sparring arrived, and in the first match, Bion and Baek Yoon were to face each other. Now it was a full-fledged match, not a childish scuffle. And that meant Bion could quite justifiably scratch Baek Yoon's eyes out. The sparring partner was supposed to be determined by drawing lots, but there was too big an age difference between Bion and her opponent by lot, so Baek Yoon was paired with her. For the overall mood, Bion had to win the match, had to cope with the bitterness of defeat from Namgun Sehon. Bion sharply lunged forward, immediately attacking Baek Yoon, but he managed to raise his sword and block the strike. Baek Yoon had already noticed that Bion, as always, tried to press only with strength. She took these words as a compliment, and a lively smile played on her face. The opponents disengaged their blades and parted. To her surprise, Bion also noted that Baek Yoon not only teased others but also trained diligently. Nevertheless, Bion did not plan to spend more than 10 strikes on this sparring. And, intercepting the blade, Bion attacked again. This time the strike hit the target, and Baek Yoon collapsed onto the stone floor. The duel was over, and Bion had already begun to think that Huashan would win this year. But after 2 more victories by Bi Ren and Bi Dam, the next 3 wins went to Wudang, despite all Huashan's efforts. Could Huashan really return home as losers? This time, Baek Gon was supposed to represent Wudang in the duel. Bion was very surprised to see her friend. Baek Gon had grown a lot since their last meeting, and now looked more like an upperclassman. Her opponent was supposed to be Jish Shan, who constantly won in sparrings. But this time the victory was for Baek Gon. All the Wudang disciples enthusiastically supported her, although just recently they were the ones mocking Baek Gon. Suddenly Bion met Baekgon's gaze. She could no longer pretend to be a stranger. Bion shyly looked away. They hadn't seen each other for a long time, but she was still watching Baekgon spar. Baekgon smiled in response and apologized for not keeping the promise to fight Bion. Bion stood shocked with her mouth open, only now remembering her promise. After that, in the third-generation sparrings, the Udan sect matched the elder against Bi Huan's second disciple, but he was very nervous and therefore lost. The Huashan disciples lost with a score of 6-9. Nevertheless, everyone eagerly awaited the duel among the second-generation students between Zhang Hui and Yui Sun. This time Zhang Hui was determined to win because he had trained hard for this day. In this match Bion was rooting for Udan, and although Zhang Hui was incredible, even though he lost last time, Bion sincerely hoped that this time Zhang Hui would still be able to win. Yi Song smiled joyfully. He was also eager to see how strong Zhang Hui had become. To everyone's surprise, the duel ended quickly, with Zhang Hui sensationally winning. Late in the evening, the third-generation students were resting in the guest house. Suddenly, Bi-Wan decided to ask, "Does Bion know what is happening with the mentors right now?" Of course, Bion knew perfectly well that a depressing atmosphere reigned among the mentors, since even Yi Song lost. Suddenly, the door of the room opened and worried Jin Yul appeared in the doorway. She could not find Yi Song anywhere and hoped to find him among the students. But Bion reported that Yi Song was not here and she had not seen him since the defeat. Then Jin Yul ordered the students to stay in place and not go anywhere, and she would continue the search. But Bion was not going to just sit and wait. She urgently needed to find Yi Song. He ran away only because he lost. Bion also ran to the mountaintop after defeat, but unlike Yi Song, she did it at home in a familiar place. Although Bion was serious, she had no idea where Yi Song could be or where he might have gone. She had already searched everywhere, but could not find a single hair of Yi Song. Bion was very frightened when a familiar voice suddenly called her. Turning around, behind her she found Zhang Hui. He had already guessed that Bion was looking for Yi Song, so he offered to take her to him. Cautiously taking Zhang Hui by the hand, Bion asked, "How does he know where Yi Song is now?" To which Zhang Hui smiled in response. There was only one place Yi Seon could go, and it was his secret place. Of course, this surprised Bion very much, but she decided to remain silent. To somehow distract herself from these thoughts, Bion decided to ask if it was true that Zhang Hui defeated Yi Seon for the first time. He nodded affirmatively. In truth, on the day of enlightenment, his first duel was with Yi Gun, because at that time Zhang Hui was the best among the Wudang disciples. Even though Huashan won then, Yi Seon ignored this and asked Zhang Hui to become his sparring partner, although Yi Gun had already defeated him. Here, Bion became interested in how Zhang Hui endured defeat, since she goes crazy every time she remembers her own defeat. Zhang Hui only smiled in response and picked Bion up in his arms. Defeat is also a good experience. Continuing on, Zhang Hui said that he is simply making up for what he lacked and moving forward, and in this way he develops. Because if you keep trying, sooner or later you will see the back of the one who defeated you, and then victory will seem much more valuable than anything else. Finally, they arrived at the place. Zhang Hui asked Bion to return before sunrise and left her alone with Yi Seon. Bion, sneaking up to the lying Yi Seon, shouted into his ear with all her might. Startled, he jumped up and was very surprised to find Bion next to him. Here Bion informed him that everyone is looking for Yi Seon and advised him to return quickly. But Yi Seon asked for a little more time, and they both lay down on the stone. Now Yi Seon finally understood what Bion felt after the defeat. Then Bion reminded him of his own words, and Yi Seon immediately apologized for his frivolity. But Bion did not want to listen to his apologies. She wanted to return Yi Seon's own words to him, because losing does not mean the end of life. He would have another chance in 4 years. Yi Seon sighed with relief. Honestly, Zhang Hui had trained hard for this victory, and he just hadn't noticed it before. But thanks to Zhang Hui's perseverance, he realized that there is no better talent than diligence. To herself, Bion noted that she and Yi Seon were very similar, so she understood his feelings. The determination that arose from the need to make the plum blossoms bloom and gain the support of Huashan disappeared as soon as Bion realized she surpassed her peers. At some point, she began to envy those who continued to work hard, like Yi Hyun and Birion. Then Yi Seon thought it would have been much better if he had tasted defeat when he was younger. Yi Seon gently stroked Bion's head. She smiled. She had always thought that Yi Seon lacked the qualities for nurturing, but even if a little clumsy, now he cared for her. Then Yi Seon smiled and threatened that from now on, if Bion skipped training, he would personally drag her to the field, no more shirking. In response, Bion only sighed heavily. Early the next morning, Bion stretched and headed to the training ground. Although the disciples of the Huashan sect lost, Nevertheless, Byeon needed to continue training properly to absorb all the energy and become much stronger. Of course, Byeon assumed that they would be scolded for the defeat anyway when they returned to Huashan. Suddenly, Baekgon approached the meditating Byeon, who had also come for training. Baekgon praised Byeon for her diligence and noted that she had changed a lot since their last meeting. Such words surprised Byeon greatly. And then Byeon advised Baekgon to step back, since she was practicing with energy, and if something went wrong, Baekgon could get hurt. To which Baekgon sincerely smiled and reminded Byeon that she hadn't even seen her off last time, deciding to sleep instead. And Baekgon was very upset about that, so now she asked Byeon to spend some time with her. Nevertheless, Byeon was not sure that it was such a big mistake on her part to sacrifice time. Of course, she was right. And Baekgon was just looking for an excuse to spend time with her friend. But what upset Baekgon the most was that Byeon couldn't keep her promise. It seemed she preferred sparring with Baekhyun more. Byeon had no reply to that. As an apology, Byeon offered Baekgon to sleep and see her off, but Baekgon would gladly prefer a meeting with her friend over sleep. After all, she hadn't seen Byeon for 4 years, so Baekgon wanted to spend as much time as possible with her friend. Suddenly, Byeon noticed that Baekgon was no longer bullying Baekhyun. Could it be that she had beaten him, as Byeon had advised? Baekgon smiled shyly. She simply trampled on Baekhyun's arrogant attitude in front of the seniors and adjusted his place in the ranking. Here, Baekgon was very surprised to hear that Byeon herself had acted that way. Could someone really have dared to bother her? Then Byeon explained that some students could not accept that she was the senior, so she had to teach them a lesson. Suddenly, Byeon appeared before them with a threatening look. She was displeased that Baekgon not only beat the Huashan students but was now annoying their senior. Frightened, Baekgon tried to explain that she did not want to bother anyone, she just hadn't seen her friend for a long time. But Byeon advised Baekgon not to worry, since she could definitely win in sparring against Byeon. However, Baekgon tried to dodge the answer by calling her friend by name. Hearing this, Byeon became furious at how Baekgon dared to call the senior simply by her name. But Baekgon saw nothing wrong with it, since Byeon was a Taoist name. Nevertheless, Byeon was still displeased, so grabbing Byeon's hand, she dragged her away. Baekgon waved goodbye, promising to definitely come to see her friend off. Having gone further away, Byeon began scolding Byeon, saying that kindness without reason did not exist in the world, especially from a person who clearly needed it. Only now did Byeon begin to understand what Byeon meant. But there was no need to worry, since Baekgon was as ascetic as she was, so there could be no relationship between them. But Byeon still worried, so she asked Byeon to continue being their senior, to which Byeon sincerely smiled and nodded. After days of exchanging experience, the student was driven through hellish training for a whole 4 months. And when this training hell ended, Byeon went to Shaolin, where the Murim Association meeting was to take place. The elders had no reason to take Byeon with them, as she was only a 3rd-generation disciple who had just begun studying martial arts, but the Feng and Namgun families asked on her behalf. But the leader set the condition that Byeon had to watch her behavior and under no circumstances fight. Only with this condition was Byeon accepted. But although the leader warned Byeon, she still intended to fix Namgun Sehon's nose. Does he really think he can hide in Sorim? Finally arriving in Sorim and finding herself on the grounds of the local temple, Byeon began to examine the architectural aspects with interest. They were greeted by a shaved-headed monk who advised the guests to stay at Chigyok, the local equivalent of Okcheon in Huashan. Finally in the room, Yui Hyun wearily straightened his shoulders. He was very tired from the long journey. Byeon decided that now was the best place to slip away. So she asked Yui Hyun to step out briefly. He agreed on the condition that Byeon would not go far from Chigyok. Byeon shot out of the room like a bullet, and immediately stopped searching for an exit. After a long search, she still managed to find Sehon and immediately demanded her hair ribbon back. Sehon was very surprised to see Byeon, as there were almost no cases where a 3rd-generation disciple was brought to the meeting. But Byeon ignored his remark and again demanded that he return her hair ribbon. Sehon mockingly raised the hand that was tied with that string. He had said he would give it back as soon as Byeon arrived in Namgun, but they were now in Shaolin. These words greatly angered Byeon. Of course, Sehon noticed this and promised to give the hair string if Byeon won the sparring match. Then Byeon decided that it was necessary to keep calm. After all, thinking about sparring is one thing, but fighting for real is quite another. Seeing her confusion, Sehon began to tease Byeon. She completely forgot about keeping calm and suggested looking for a place for sparring. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to Byeon. It was Feng Haran's older brother. He immediately jumped up to Byeon and started asking if she had seen Haran. To which Byeon shook her head negatively. The elder began to lament because Haran had a very weak body, and he was supposed to take Jinso Ryun with him. At the mention of this name, Bion was struck as if by lightning, because the main character from her favorite novel, Return of the Sword God, was named exactly the same. Although the probability of meeting someone with the same name in Murim is extremely high, so Bion still decided to check. And she was already about to ask Feng's eldest son about Jin So-ryun, but he quickly ran off in search of Haran. Anyway, while Bion was here, she decided to find out more about Jin So-ryun. Finally, after a short search, Bion and Sehon found a rather distant building that hardly anyone would decide to enter anytime soon. Sehon joked about Bion again and, boldly stepping forward, opened the building's gate, but immediately slammed the door shut with a shout and jumped back. With tears in his eyes, Sehon clung to Bion, shouting that inside the building there was a white-haired ghost with red eyes. Of course, Bion did not believe his words. What ghosts could there be in Shaolin? And despite Sehon's protests, she opened the gates. A smile played on Bion's face. Naturally, there was no ghost inside, but there was Feng Haran, who, smiling in response, greeted Bion and called Sehon a fool. Sehon was upset and tried to protest, but Feng immediately retorted that only a fool would call a dying person a ghost, or are a person's feelings not that important. Then Bion decided to ask why Feng had come to this place. His older brother was already looking for him, to which he replied that he just felt sad, so he hid here. But Bion was not satisfied with that answer. She wanted to know what had upset him so much. Feng promised to tell if only they could cheer him up. Suddenly, Bion suggested that Feng become the judge in their sparring match with Sehon. Feng was a little embarrassed because he expected fun, but they were making him judge a duel. However, after a short persuasion, he agreed. The opponents stood facing each other. Everything was ready for the start of the duel. Without agreeing on the start, Bion swiftly rushed forward and attacked, but Sehon managed to block the strike, though it was not easy for him. Bion smiled proudly. She had said that once she got used to the sword, she would be able to defeat Sehon. The sun was already at its zenith, but the duel in the abandoned building was still ongoing. The fighters had already lost track of time, but it felt like several hours had passed. Finally, Sehon decided that it was time to end the duel and attacked lightning fast. The trajectory of the sword's movement changed, which greatly surprised Bion. Could it be that Sehon had been hiding an ace up his sleeve all this time? Fortunately, Bion had something to respond with. Although she had just mastered this technique, there was a chance it would work this time. Sehon used Namgun's sword technique, Emperor's Sword, and in response, Bion used one of the 24 Plum Blossom techniques, Plum Blossom by the Road. A crash sounded, and for a short time the room was flooded with bright light. The opponents separated in opposite directions to catch their breath. Sehon was the first to recover, immediately declaring that the victory was theirs, since Bion was the first to drop her weapon, but she strongly disagreed. Suddenly, Hanam intervened in the quarrel, reminding them that he was the judge in this duel. The fighters then began to pressure Hanam, urging him to judge impartially and accusing the opponent of cheating one after another. According to Hanam, the duel ended in a draw, but he was more concerned about what to do with the Buddha statue that had fallen from its pedestal during the match. Finally, Bion and Sehon realized what the crash during the last move was, and horror was reflected on their faces. Sehon immediately fell to his knees and began to repent for what he had done. Hanam picked up the blade from the ground and correctly named each technique used by Sehon and Bion. Then he easily repeated Bion's movements, precisely reproducing the technique. But since he did not know the basics, it was quite difficult. Everything seen stunned Bion. Hanam simply took and repeated such a complex technique. Of course, she had heard that there were many geniuses in the big world, but it was hard to believe. Suddenly, Hanam repeated the Emperor's Sword technique with the same ease. Astonished, Sehon wanted to know how Hanam did it, to which he replied that he already knew the movements. Sekon himself demonstrated the technique. The rest Hanam understood intuitively. But such an answer clearly did not satisfy Sekon, for only the head of the family or the young master knew the movements. So how did Hanamu know about them? Hanamu had no reason to hide anything, so he directly said that the movements were shown to him by Sekon's sister, Sein. Struck like lightning, Sekon froze in place. That was definitely a lie. Sein could not tell this to a stranger. But Hanam urged Sehon not to worry, since he was watching closely, so he knows nothing beyond simple movements. Nevertheless, Sekon was still upset because his sister had taught him only a few moves. Bion, who was watching all this from the side, wondered, could Sehon really not be the heir? There was clearly something wrong with the Namgun family, although the head of the family had always been kind to him. And since Sein managed to show Hanamu the secret technique, it means that she is the heir of the Feng family, although it was strange that the secret techniques were revealed to a child from another family. Moreover, it did not seem that Sein cared about Sekon enough to teach his brother the family's secret techniques. Moreover, Bion remembered that when Sehon was in trouble, even for just a moment, Sein looked pleased. And although it did not concern her at all, Bion still felt strange. Personally, Hanam saw nothing strange in such behavior from Sein, as it was a drop of mercy for a child who would soon die. Moreover, he would soon not be able to raise a sword at all. Then he suddenly broke free from Sehon's hands and grabbed him by the collar, declaring that Sehon must not dare to show him pity in his face, and if he really wants to sympathize, then he should behave like Bion. Dissatisfied, Sehon broke free from the grip as soon as he was told about it earlier. Everyone is so cautious around Hanam, so he decided to do the same. Now it was Hanama's turn to get angry, since he had told Sehon to be cautious, just not to show pity towards him. But for Sehon, these were the same things. The observer of the quarrel Bion finally realized that the matter was beginning to take a serious turn. Namgun Sehon was banned from going out due to the incident with the Buddha statue. He was not allowed to leave the guest house. Fen Haram could formally move freely, but his brothers constantly watched him. Bion felt awkward because only the guys were punished. But Karam just waved his hand. After all, they are members of a big clan, and Bion is a sect disciple, so the punishment for her will be harsher. That day in the abandoned temple, the eldest brother Fen Haran discovered the trio. Seeing the fallen statue of Buddha, he became furious. Therefore Bion here decided to take all the blame on herself. But Haram interrupted her, stating that he and Sehon did it. Despite their recent feud, Sehon confirmed Karen's words and also took the blame upon himself. Of course, Bion did not know why Sehon played along with Haran, but thanks to this she avoided punishment from the elders of Huashan. Suddenly Bion reminded Haran why he was sad, but he never told the reason. Maybe it was something serious. Haran nodded affirmatively. The thing was that one of his friends had died, and his other friend, Jin So Ryun, saw how he fell from the cliff. Because of this terrible incident, Jin So Ryun fell into a terrible state. So Haran blamed himself that despite his stubbornness, he could not bring Jin So Ryun to the Muram Union meetings. Of course, Bion knew that not everyone was allowed to attend the Muram Union meeting, so how could So Ryun get in? The thing was that he was the son of the head of the Myeonmun cult. According to Haran, it was a small cult, but quite well known in Hubei. Of course, he assumed that Bion had not heard of it, but she knew perfectly well about Myeonmun. After all, the main character of Return of the Sword God, Jin So Ryun, son of the head of Myeonmun, the youngest of the Feng family, lost a friend from his cult at the age of 10 when he fell from a cliff. Jin So Ryun's childhood friend, who appeared in the novel, and thanks to whom the Bloody Lord obtained the rarest artifact of the Feng family from Hubei. Then Bion remembered exactly what that artifact was. Dried red eyes belonging to So Ryun's friend who suffered from albinism. Before So Ryun's return, the sect was destroyed, and the friend himself was blinded. Nevertheless, he left behind a fully restored technique, Dokmun Chulgi, which was considered destroyed during the Magio invasion. Despite all efforts, So Ryun could not save his friend, who left this world due to an energy flow disease and died from meridian rupture. In the novel, this friend was named Lan A. Of course, Haran noticed how pale Bion's face became, and asked if this was too heavy a topic for conversation. But she just shook her head. Also, Bion remembered that Feng Haran was the most precious person to So Ryun in the plot, but he was already dead and appeared only in flashbacks. Moreover, he was called only by his childhood name Lan A. Therefore, the fact that Lana is actually Feng Haran, and also that Bion is inside the world of Return of the Sword God, she realized only now. And since this was the world of Return of the Sword God, whatever laws existed in this world, Feng Haran inevitably had to die. With heavy thoughts, Bion returned to her room. Yi Gan immediately noticed the change in her mood. Cheerfully picking Bion up in his arms, he promised to punish everyone involved in Bion's bad mood, the elder who was behind and only resented Yi Gan's behavior. Suddenly, Bion decided to ask Yi Gan's mentor what would happen if a war with Magio started. Yi Gan immediately changed his expression and carefully put Bion on the floor. The elder's face also darkened. They began to question Bion about where she had heard about Magio. Could it be that some outsider was gossiping? But Bion only shook her head negatively, saying she was just curious. Yi Gan asked her not to say such nonsense in the future, suggesting that Bion was simply tired from the difficult journey to Shaolin. Therefore, he advised her to go to her room and rest. From the way the elder and Yi Gan reacted, Bion understood that something related to Magio was happening. The war with Magio was supposed to start when the main character, So Ryun, turned 20 years old. There were still 10 years left in reserve. At first, Bion decided to figure out Return of the Sword God. It is a rather long work that continued to be published even at the time of her death. The main plotline tells about Jin So Ryun, who lost everything because of Magio, but returned to the past and in his second life fought against them. The problem was that Beyond did not know whether she was in the first or the second timeline. Moreover, the novel was not finished, so completely unexpected events could occur. Even after returning to the past, So Ryun did not realize for a long time that he had been reincarnated. The realization came only after the destruction of the Myanmar sect on Heron's 20th birthday. The shock from the tragedy made So Ryun realize his reincarnation. Therefore, whether it was the first or the second line, So Ryun was now an ordinary child. The first war between the righteous and demonic schools ended in a catastrophic defeat. Naturally, Huashan, one of the 9 great clans, also did not escape destruction. Of course, Beyond did not know whether reincarnation had already occurred or not. It remained either to hope that it was the second line or, if it was the first, to try to change the plot to avoid a sad ending. The next day, Beyond, pressing her face against the wall, tried to come up with something, but nothing came to mind since she was just a junior disciple. If she spoke about the demonic sect becoming active, she would simply be ridiculed. It remained to become the greatest master by the age of 20 and join So Ryun. Suddenly, Beyond's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar mocking voice. Turning around, she found Sehon. But wasn't he forbidden to go out? In response, Sehon just laughed. Of course, he had simply slipped out unnoticed. Nevertheless, Beyond worried whether he had been scolded severely. But Sehon said that he was rarely reprimanded at all, and his father was strict only with his sister. Then Beyond began to recall that, according to the novel, in 10 years the current head of the Namgun family would become the leader of the Murim alliance, and his daughter, Sehon's sister, would inherit the position of head. Sehon noticed Beyond's serious expression and remarked that she could be a bit gentler with her savior. But Beyond immediately protested. When did Sehon become her savior? To which he reminded her of the incident with the statue. As punishment, Beyond would definitely have been sent to the Hall of Repentance. Then Beyond became curious why Sekon took the blame. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head and said it was a matter of honor. After all, Karen tried to cover his tracks to help Beyond escape, and it would be logical if the one who was punished less took the blame. Suddenly Beyond felt ashamed that even Sekon had such deep thoughts, while she was an adult and happy that she was not being punished. Therefore Beyond intended to show everyone what it means to be an adult, and swiftly strode past the surprised Sekon. The chapter was very surprised to hear that it was Beyond together with Sekon who destroyed the floor in the temple and damaged the statue of Buddha. And then he burst out with an angry tirade that Beyond, who caused all this chaos, did not even win, but only drew. And when she returns to Huashan, she will go to the Hall of Repentance. Finally the cleaning was done, and Beyond triumphantly raised her hands. Sehon, who was sitting nearby, did not share his friend's enthusiasm. Why create problems for yourself? According to Sekon, removing such a large temple was too severe a punishment. But Beyond believed that the abbot of Shaolin treated her generously. Nevertheless, the business was settled, and the children decided to go have fun. Upon entering the main square, Sekon was very surprised by the excessive number of people, to which Beyond only smirked. Tomorrow the Murim Union meeting was starting, so it was no surprise to see this crowd. Suddenly Beyond collided with a menacing-looking man who had a scar on the right side crossing both lips. Beyond froze in place, feeling a colossal aura emanating from the person. It was not like hostility or a desire to kill. There was something oppressive in it. Therefore, Beyond immediately apologized and introduced herself as befits a Murim disciple. Suddenly, the man smiled and asked the name of Beyond's father, which greatly puzzled her. After gathering herself a little, Beyond explained that she was left in Huashan when she was a child, so she did not know her father's name, but she could give the name of her teacher, who became like a parent to her. A satisfied smile played on the man's face. He liked Beyond's audacity, yet he had an important conversation, so he asked her to call her teacher. But Yi Hyun was already swiftly running towards Beyond and the man with the scar. Stopping, he immediately bowed his head and, as is proper, greeted the king of Fist Yunnan Hyuk Yugun. Beyond's eyes widened in surprise. The person before her was such a great master that even his nickname included the prefix king. Yi Hyun was very surprised to hear that the king of Fist had a conversation for him regarding his disciple. Beyond herself was no less surprised. Had she done something wrong again? When the adults left, Beyond could not get the thought out of her mind about what they would talk about. And Sehon declared that the prefix king in the nickname sounded cool. Suddenly a dispute broke out between them. Beyond believed that the prefix honor or sword was much cooler, while Sehon stood his ground. Unexpectedly, Haran, who appeared, intervened in their argument. He was very surprised when he heard that one of the 10 highest Murim masters wanted to know the name of Beyond's father. Perhaps the king of Fist was acquainted with Beyond's biological father? Sehon also noted that the King of Fist behaved as if he was seeing Beyond for the first time. Therefore, Beyond suggested that Hyuk Yugan remembered someone upon seeing her. Perhaps it was all because of her unusual appearance. After all, the older she got, the more gray hair appeared. Nevertheless, this was not proof that the King of the Fist could know her father, even if the face and hair color matched. After all, it could have been just a distant relative. Karin, coughing, suggested asking everything directly. Sekon and Beyond were horrified, as Karin's brothers could jump out at any moment. Therefore, they decided to retreat to the guest house and wait until they were called. King of the Fist of Yunnan, Hyuk Yugan, is one of the 10 masters closest to the title of the strongest in the world, along with the elder Mu Yon. So why did such a serious person want to talk to Ui Hyun about Beyond? Could it be that she caused trouble again? Of course, Ui Hyun still hoped that was not the case. Seeing how tense Yi Hyun became, Hyuk Yugan immediately stated that Beyond had done nothing of the sort, although she was quite mischievous. He just wanted to know who the student's father was. Then Yi Hyun told that 10 years ago, at the monastery gates, they took in Beyond. They do not know who her parents are or how she came to Huashan. Fortunately, the child, instead of unknown parents, considered Huashan as home and family, and grew up without a single shadow on his heart. Therefore, they simply considered it fate and raised Beyond. These words made Hyuk Yugan smile. Then, pointing to the scar, he said that Beyond looks very much like the person who inflicted this injury on him. Then Yi Hyun still decided to assume that the person who inflicted this wound must already be dead. But Hyuk Yugan shook his head negatively. For Yi Hyun, it was surprising that a person who managed to leave a wound on the face of one of the highest masters remained alive. But if you think about it, the one who left Beyond at the top of Huashan was definitely an unusual person. Indeed, Beyond is much more talented than her peers. Even Hyuk Yugan, with his intuition, felt something in her. Perhaps the person he talks about could be Beyond's father, but these are just guesses. But Hyuk Yugan continued to insist. Beyond was so similar that it would be strange if she was not related by blood to this person. Of course, Yi Hyuk understood everything, but the world is full of similar people, and baseless confidence is always a risk. Then Hyuk Yugan said that this happened 11 years ago, when this person himself left the place he had created. And exactly a year later he returned as if nothing had happened, and once again stained his hands with blood. Identical appearance, perfectly matching age. Hyuk Yugan could not help but doubt, so he wanted to check it. After all, parents should recognize their child even after 10 years. Only now did Yi Hyuk begin to realize. Could it be that Hyuk Yugan wants to bring Beyond together with the one who abandoned her? Then Yi Hyuk suddenly jumped up and asked if Hyuk Yugan really did not think about the wound this would inflict on the child. But he only smirked in response, stating that it was not his concern. At this point, Yi Hyuk finally raised his voice. He, like all of Huashan, could not just watch their disciple suffer. Hyuk Yugan looked approvingly. He thought Yi Hyuk was just a youth, but it seemed he was doing well in the role of teacher. As a senior warrior, Hyuk Yugan found this commendable, but even that could not extinguish his long-standing hatred. Therefore, he suggested asking Beyond's opinion on the matter, since everyone wants to know their roots. And if Yi Hyuk truly values his disciple, he should respect her choice. Cheerfully flying into the room, Beyond clasped her hands together and greeted the King of Fists of Yunnan, introducing herself as the junior disciple of the martial arts world. Hyuk Yugan immediately corrected her, since she was supposed to introduce herself as an apprentice, not a student. Beyond felt embarrassed by her mistake. Suddenly, Hyuk Yugan asked if Beyond wanted to know who her father was. But she asked in return if the King of the Fist was really sure that he was her father. To which Hyuk Yugan replied that it would become clear when Beyond met this man. And then Beyond wondered if it was about her biological father who left her before Huashan. Did she really want to see him? Finally, Beyond firmly stated that she was not going to meet this man, because she did not want to find out the reason why she was abandoned and endure all that pain. It was better for her to continue living without knowing whether her father was alive or dead. Maybe he was a complete stranger, and then it would be awkward for both of them. Hyuk Yugan laughed heartily. He liked Beyond's answer, and if that was her choice, he would not insist. But still Beyond doubted, since Hyuk Yugan, the King of the Fist, could act as he wished, not considering the opinion of a simple student. The next morning, Beyond told Haran about the meeting with the King of the Fist. He praised her for her courage, since Beyond's decision should come first. Suddenly, Beyond noticed that today it was completely empty, not a soul around. Haran smiled, saying it was because today was the day of the meeting and the masters had gathered to discuss important matters. Suddenly, a noise was heard behind. It was Sehon, whom a similar-looking young man and woman were trying with all their might to hold back, as they had to ensure that no incidents occurred. Bion recognized the young man. His name was Jug Yun, who had been with Sehon for 2 years, but she saw the girl for the first time. Seeing Bion, Juge-young trembled with fear, recalling an incident from 2 years ago. The girl, named Juge-shi, who was Yong's sister, arrogantly asked, "Could Sehon really be involved with a child of no family, since he is a representative of a family, not some simpleton?" Of course, Sehon protested that Bion was not a child without family at all, but she immediately countered, saying she had never seen Bion at meetings, so she probably was not from a noble family. But seeing the Huashan mark on Bion's chest, she immediately broke into a kind smile and introduced herself as etiquette required. Despite all the persuasion, Sehon intended to stay with Bion and promised to sit quietly, ordering Yong to return to the guest house. Then Haran suggested that Sehon and his companions stay, and he would leave with Bion. But Sehon disagreed, grabbing Bion's hand. Bion looked at him in surprise. But Sehon unexpectedly declared that he had come only because Bion was here, and if she left, he would follow. A malicious smile appeared on Bion's face, and only now did Sehon realize what he had said and hastily covered his mouth with his hands. Then Sehon tried to fix the situation, saying he simply made a mistake and did not mean that. But everyone else already understood everything. To somehow ease the embarrassment, he asked what Haran and Bion had been talking about. Hearing in response that the conversation was about the Murim Alliance meeting, and the topic of the meeting was the division of the Alliance, suddenly she interrupted the conversation, saying that was not true. But she knew the real reason for the Alliance gathering, which she learned from her aunt, the strategist. Therefore, she asked those present not to reveal this secret to outsiders. In fact, the Murim Alliance was convened due to the activation of the demonic cult. In the center of Shaolin's defense where the Murim Alliance meeting was held, the leader of the White Path of the Murim Alliance, Gongyang Desa, reported that traces of the demonic cult were found simultaneously in several places. Jiang Deza also added that thanks to several failed attempts to kidnap 10-year-old children from great families and sects, they discovered that this was a planned operation of the demonic cult. The demonic cult, also known as the Sun and Moon religion, is a military force based on worship of power, the sky, and demons, with a base in the Jingshan Mountains. About 60 years ago, 3 great powers in the East became involved in a war known as the Great Murim War of the Sun and Moon. In response to the colossal power of the demonic cult, Baekto, the sect of the Righteous Path, formed a temporary alliance with Hakdo, the sect of the Dark Path. The two alliances waged a long and protracted war for 4 years before signing a truce. However, in the process, the alliance with Hakdo became a disgrace for Baekto, which they tried to erase. One of the achievements of this alliance was the capture of Cheonhwakyun, a sacred artifact of the demonic cult. Fragments of the artifact were kept in the hands of some from Baekto and Hakdo. Suddenly, the Murim strategist Juge Ilyon intervened in the conversation. For her, it was strange that all the victims turned out to be owners of fragments of the demonic cult. But the head of the Danmok family disagreed with her, since for 56 years no one had tried to find Cheonhwakyun. Could Ilyon not provide more convincing arguments? Then Ilyon suggested that the head of the Danmok family was so skeptical because his eldest grandson was harmed in such a recent kidnapping incident. And the head of the Danmok family simply does not want to admit it. Because if it really is the work of the demonic sect, then his grandson might be a cuckoo chick. The cuckoo lays eggs in the nests of other birds. Such a cuckoo chick, to seize all the food, pushes out and kills the chicks that were in the nest. Children, whom the demonic cult took and brainwashed, were like cuckoo chicks. They dissolve into society without any problems, and then kill all the young warriors in their ranks. 60 years ago, this strategy of the demonic cult led to the destruction of many sects and families. Suddenly, one of those present interrupted the conversation, since there were no remnants of the artifacts stored in Huashan. Does it mean the strategist's theory was wrong? The other members of the alliance began whispering that there might be a disciple in Huashan connected to the demonic cult. Jinmun Jin immediately stopped all conversations, as this was an internal problem of Huashan, not a topic for outsiders to discuss. But the others immediately protested, as they had heard that Huashan had taken in an abandoned child, and he might be connected to the demonic cult. Jinmun Jin angrily ordered everyone to be silent immediately. How could anyone doubt a child who grew up in Huashan since infancy? Were they supposed to tolerate such accusations? Then the King of Fist, Hyuk Ugan, intervened in the conversation. He swore by his name that the child taken in by Huashan was not a cuckoo chick. The noise immediately died down. Since the King of Fist said this, everyone was satisfied with such an answer. The head of Jin even bit his lip in anger, as he disliked the King of Fist so much, yet he was grateful. After listening to the reports, everyone concluded that the Murim alliance still remains a weak and unstable alliance. Due to the recent actions of the demonic cult, it was time to restore the Murim alliance. When the negotiations that lasted several days ended, it was time to return to Huashan. It was a useful visit that made Bion realize that she was in the universe of Return of the Sword God, and that it was the demonic sect that tried to kidnap her. Yihyuk, noticing Sehon rushing towards them, stopped Bion so she could say goodbye to her friend. But Bion declared that Sehon was not her friend. These words greatly surprised Sehon. Weren't they friends? But Bion could not consider as a friend someone who humiliated her. Moreover, Sehon had too high standards for friendship. But since this time Sehon showed loyalty, maybe next time Bion would consider him a friend. Then Sehon, smiling, said he would return Bion's hair ribbon when they became friends again. After such a noisy farewell, Bion went home, but in Huashan a small commotion broke out again. Out of breath, Bi-hun informed Bion that recently the senior students, including Bi-hwan and other 14-year-olds, had become somewhat strange. Bion, who was carelessly strolling around the temple surroundings, was very surprised, since everything had been calm since their return from Shaolin. What had happened to the students? Some of the students became excessively dramatic, others too aggressive, and still others were deeply immersed in reading. Of course, Bion understood what it was about, and a satisfied smile played on her face. The students had reached 14 years old, which meant that puberty had begun. In the end, the students raging in the midst of a teenage crisis were caught by their mentors and taken to a closed training session. This was otherwise called the 8th grader syndrome, proof that the Jinshan students had already reached 14 years old. This whole situation made Bion think about the Tao, since she had already talked with the Great Elder about it. The true unchanging Tao is something that can only be attained independently, through enlightenment. Naturally, Bion still had not found the answer, but she also wanted to understand the Tao and bloom the plum blossom. After all, this was the way to move forward. At sunset, Bion met with the Great Elder to find answers to her questions about the Tao. The Great Elder laughed kindly, for the Tao made no sense if Bion herself did not comprehend it. And the path that Bion points to, someone else could only be a guide, but could not be her thought. But Bion believed that even a guide was already good. Moreover, the ancestors had surely already found the answer. So what is the difference? To remember it oneself, or to discover it oneself? To which the Great Elder replied that even if an answer or guide is found, if Bion does not understand it with her mind and heart, it will be only an empty sound. But Bion still could not understand anything. Yet the Great Elder decided to encourage the disciple, for this very path of searching is the essence of learning the Tao. Nevertheless, Bion still doubted whether she could find the Tao in her entire life. What if she could not bloom the plum blossom? After all, achievements in martial arts and the Tao are different things. These were words that Bion could not even say to Yi-hyun because of pride. Although she realized her superiority in martial arts, in her heart remained an unquenched aspiration and anxiety. Then the Great Elder advised Bion not to fixate on the plum blossom. Only by letting go of her obsession could she grasp the truth. These words helped Bion calm down a bit. Perhaps she really was rushing too much. After all, she could inherit other martial arts of Huashan instead of the plum. Unexpectedly, the Great Elder declared that Bion should remember his teachings, for today's conversation was the old man's final instruction. That day, the smile of the Great Elder showed Bion would probably not be forgotten until the end of her life. After that, time flew by quickly. Bion was able to absorb all the energy from Chaso's medicine. She teased the students sent to closed training because of the 8th grader syndrome, especially Bi-hwan. 4 whole years passed, and the students were again chatting about the upcoming Murim Union meeting, spending time as happily as before. For Bion, these were ordinary, unchanging days. However, the Murim Union meeting this time was cancelled due to circumstances in Huashan. Bion was then 13 years old. Bion quickly rushed into Huashan's medical ward, intending to visit the Great Elder. But Elder Jin-san, head of the medical ward, again forbade anyone from disturbing the patient. Placing his hand on Bion's shoulder, Jin-san advised her not to worry. The Great Elder had simply lain down and would soon get out of bed. Everyone understood this was a white lie, but no one could say a word. Adults often thought children understood nothing. Worried, Yi-hyun finally found Bion and, grabbing her, held her tightly to his chest, saying that everything would be fine with the Great Elder. But Bion, stepping back, asked him to wait outside the door, just like last time with Elder Mu-jin. Of course, Bion understood everything. Tears sprang from her eyes. She simply did not want to see the Great Elder suffer. After all, it was too terrible a sight, and Bion was afraid she would not be able to endure it. Yi-hyun hugged his student and whispered in her ear that parting with a loved one is painful. But if you run away out of fear, only regret will remain for a lifetime. Separation is the end not only for the one who leaves but also for the one who stays. Bion experienced strong internal changes that had not been there before. Besides physical suffering, there were others waiting for her ahead. The condition of the great elder lying in bed was far from good. The vase shattered with a crash. Bion jumped back in fright, not understanding how she could have dropped the vase from her hands. She immediately rushed to gather the shards, but was careless and cut her finger. Bi Huan, who was nearby, immediately rushed to Bion to examine the wound. Since Bion was a martial arts master, she was used to seeing blood, but for some reason, she had a bad feeling, especially considering the condition of the Supreme Elder. And although the Supreme Elder had come to himself because he felt a little better, he still could not be visited. Suddenly, Bion called out to the second-generation student, former chief instructor of the selection exam Yi Jin, and asked him to follow him. Of course, Bion hoped that the worry was in vain. But the day she hoped would never come finally arrived. Bion found herself in the chambers of the Elder. Usually, disciples of Y and Bai, and even disciples of Du could not enter the chambers of the Supreme Elder. If the Supreme Elder called Bion despite everything, it meant it was time to say goodbye. In her past life, Bion was alone and could not understand how painful it is to lose someone beloved. When Bion approached the bed, tears sprang from her eyes. The Supreme Elder asked her not to be sad, for farewell is part of growing up. But Bion did not know what to do now. For the Elder had promised to achieve transformation and rejuvenation and live long. How could he treat her this way? Then the Supreme Elder asked Jin, who was beside the bed, to hand over his sword. Carefully taking the sword in his hands, the Supreme Elder passed his sword to Bion. Now it belonged to her. The others present were very surprised by the Elder's decision to pass his sword to a third-generation disciple. But Jin immediately put a finger to his lips, silencing them. Of course, the Supreme Elder hoped to pass the sword to Bion when she grew up. But this was not destined to happen, and he was sorry. Nevertheless, Bion promised to grow strong and justify the name Huashan. The Elder left the Huashan sect in the hands of his disciples. Such was the last will of the Supreme Elder. Thus ended Bion's childhood. After the Elder's funeral, Bion focused on training. For a whole week, she did not let go of the Elder's sword. The person who had occupied most of Bion's life was no longer alive, and she felt lonely and empty, as if a gaping hole had formed in place of the happiest moments of her life. Bion was worried that she would not withstand all this sadness, so she asked Jin Yol to find her a place for training. Therefore, she left the mountain and focused on training. On one of those days, Biryun came to visit her. Bion was very surprised to see her friend. But how did Biryun find out about this place? It turned out that Jin Yol told her about this, but in fact Biryun sent Yi Hyun here because he wanted to know when Bion would return home. Also, Yi Hyun hoped that the request from a peer would put less pressure on Bion. But if she needs more time, she can come back later. In principle, Yi Hyun could have come himself, but everything was fine. Bion was going back anyway. When they set out, Biryun reported that many spoke of the Elder's sword. But Bion was not surprised, for it was the sword of cold steel plumwood. Nevertheless, the Elder left Bion a sword as an inheritance, made of the finest cold steel, 10,000 years old, called Plum Blossom on the Snow. Bion heard that originally the sword belonged to the Master Elder, who was the greatest swordsman of Huashan of that generation, so it was supposed to be received by the Elder's disciple Jin Myung. Therefore Bion thought it better to return the sword herself before the conflict began. But this was the last thing received from the Elder. When Bion thought that this sword was the last memory of the Supreme Elder, she did not want to give it away just like that. Of course, 1 week was too little to overcome the loss. Nevertheless, Bion was confident that she would manage. Suddenly, Biryun smiled kindly and asked if Bion remembered their entrance exam. Back then, Biryun was a willful child with a stone on her soul, and yet Bion extended her hand to her, as kind and just as they teach in Huashan. Even before becoming a disciple of Huashan, perhaps Bion was already fulfilling the Elder's will. The great Elder's cause will not be forgotten, for it is continued by his disciples. So Bion believed that the Elder's will would remain in their hearts forever. By the temple gates they were met by Yi Sun, and Biryun, after saying goodbye, left them alone. Yi Sun was concerned about Bion's well-being, and then gently stroked her head, to which Bion, smiling, replied that such longing would not pass even after 7 days and nights. But still this event would have to be let go. Of course, Yi Sun was glad about the return of his ward and suggested going inside. Bion nodded affirmatively. Suddenly Bion asked how the talks about the sword were going. She was still afraid that the elders would try to take it away. Then Yi Sun told that the elder Jin Myun tried to prove that the sword belonged to him. But all this ended when Elder Jin reproached him for not fulfilling the last will of the Supreme Elder. Suddenly, Yi Hyun appeared behind them. He was extremely displeased that Yi Sun was spreading rumors and trying to turn Bion against the senior disciples. Nevertheless, Yi Hyun was glad about the return of his disciple, Smiling, Byeon apologized for not coming back earlier. Of course, Yi Hyun did not want Byeon to become like Yi Sun, who teased and provoked the seniors because in these times it was necessary to be cautious. Smiling sincerely, Yi Hyun added that Byeon would not give up the sword, even if someone pressured her. After all, she was the rightful owner of the sword. Hearing Yi Hyun's serious voice, Byeon felt unconditional support, because these people would always be on her side. Byeon's heart, torn by the loss of the Supreme Elder, began to heal a little. Therefore, she promised herself to work with everyone to fulfill Hwashan's will. Suddenly, Yi Hyun said that Byeon would have to go down to Hwaum to buy a new sword. It was better to stay in the shadows until the rumors about the Elder's sword died down. Of course, Byeon could use her old sword, but it was time for her to learn the 14th Plum Blossom sword technique. Besides, she needed to use a sword that fit her size. Byeon was very surprised to hear that she would study the 14th Bloom technique, not the 24th. Since Byeon had reached the 7th level of the 7th Plum Blossom and received a sword for self-improvement, Yi Hyun believed it was time to prepare for learning the exalted martial arts. After all, to learn the 24th Bloom technique, Byeon needed to reach at least the 5th level of the 14th Bloom technique. Of course, Byeon tried to object, since she had already learned the first of the 24 movements, but Yi Hyun was adamant. In the end, Byeon gave in, although she wanted to learn the sword technique of the 24th Plum Blossom as soon as possible. Then Yi Sun, stroking Byeon's head, proposed a condition. If she could reach the 3rd level of the sword technique of the 14th Plum Blossom by the end of the year, then Yi Sun promised to teach her the sword technique of the 24th Plum Blossom. Byeon looked at him with doubt. At that moment, Byeon thought it over. She had 4 months left until the end of the year, which should be enough time to reach the 3rd level. And although Byeon considered Yi Sun a bad teacher, she still decided to support his idea. In response to this statement, Yi Sun proposed another. Since Byeon did not want to learn from him, then let Yi Hyun teach her. The meeting of the dragon and the tiger, which had been postponed due to the death of the Supreme Elder, was to take place very soon. Therefore, Byeon decided to train hard and show the disciples of the Wooden sect what the Hwashan sword was. Suddenly, Byeon was attracted by noise in the next room, and looking in, she found Bi-ryun, who was clumsily trying to hold a stack of letters in her hands. Then Byeon decided to ask when Bi-ryun had become so popular that she received so many letters. But Bi-ryun herself wanted to know the answer to this question, since the letters were addressed to Byeon. Of course, Byeon did not believe her ears. Probably these were just dual requests. But, opening one of the letters, her eyes widened in surprise, for she recognized the name on the envelope, and after looking through the other letters, Byeon also recognized the senders of these letters. It turned out that 3 people had written to her at once. A letter expressing condolences and heartfelt concern, written in clear and straightforward handwriting, belonged to Baek-gon. Calm words of comfort, written in thin, clear handwriting, belonged to Fung Haran. And finally, Namgun Sehon's letter was filled with questions about Byeon's well-being. It seemed that he tried very hard to write neatly, but the end of the letter looked a bit messy. Here Byeon wondered why all the other letters were from Sehon. Bi-ryun did not know the exact answer but dared to assume that he was simply nervous because Byeon did not reply. And since Sehon was impatient, Byeon decided to answer him first. Sitting at the writing desk, she quickly wrote a reply. Bi-ryun, looking over her friend's shoulder, was very surprised. Could she really be going to send such a letter to Namgun Sehon? Knowing his character, he would immediately run to Hwashan. But Byeon just laughed in response. Sehon's family would clearly never allow that. Besides, he was bad at navigating, so she was sure that Sehon wouldn't even make it. A letter from Byeon finally arrived at the Habuk Fung clan, and Haran happily unfolded it and began to read. So Ryun, who was nearby, noticed that Haran had been waiting quite a long time for the reply. To which Haran replied that there was nothing strange about that, since Byeon had just lost her loved one, and they both knew how hard that was. Haran promised to introduce Byeon at the next meeting. So Ryun smiled quite pleasantly. He was very curious to see Haran's new friend. In the Wudang sect, Baek-gon finally also received the letter she had been so desperately waiting for. The messenger who delivered the letter, throwing it on the ground, quickly left. Baek-gon looked angrily at the back of the envoy. How dare he throw away the letter from Byeon? 5 years had passed since she last saw Byeon. The postponed meeting of the dragon and the tiger was supposed to happen in 6 months, and Baek-gon would not wait. At the same time, Sehon, who was conducting the sparring, was distracted by a hawk flying over the temple. The opponent smiled joyfully. He could not believe that Sehon was so easily distracted during sparring. Deciding that this was his chance, he rushed to attack. But Sehon paid no attention to this attack. With one movement, knocking the wooden sword out of the opponent's hands, he pulled a letter from the hawk that had landed. The other students only whispered that Sehon had finally received a letter from the very child who had lasted against him for a whole 30 moves. Sehon even began to tremble with anticipation. Quickly unfolding the letter, he was horrified. There was not even a page inside. In it, Bion reported that she still had not recovered and asked Sehon to stop mocking the messenger hawk and to stop sending letters. But Sehon concluded that Bion was still sad, and despite the prohibition, immediately rushed to write another letter. He was worried about Bion, so he suggested that if it was too hard for her to stay in Huashan, she could come to the Namgun clan where she would always be welcome. Of course, if Bion did come to Namgun, Sehon would try very hard to help her forget her sorrow even for a moment. Despite this, a few days later Bion sent another letter in which she declined the offer, because she had been trimming leaves all week and suggested that Sehon come himself. This fact greatly surprised Sehon before he would have thrown a tantrum as usual, but Bion was already having a hard time. Nevertheless, he took the invitation as a challenge. But Sehon's father and head of the Namgun family, Namgun Gijin, was against his son's trip to Huashan, as it was inappropriate since a funeral had recently taken place there. According to Guijin, Sehon was mature enough to distinguish the appropriate time and place from the inappropriate. Sion, who was watching the conversation between her brother and father, was disappointed that Bion was a disciple of the Taoist sect. After all, if Bion were the daughter of some noble family, they could have offered Sehon as a son-in-law for them, excluding him from the family. In spring, when Bion turned 14, the meeting of the Huashan and Wudang sects, postponed due to the funeral of the Supreme Elder, took place. Baek Yang joyfully greeted the students of Huashan, noting how Bion had grown during this time. When the formalities were over, Baek Yang suggested Bion move to a quiet, secluded place. Here Bion wondered, does she really want a sparring match? Baek Yang just wanted to discuss something, but Bion refused, citing that Baek Yang could speak in the presence of others. At first Baek Yang hesitated, then whispered into Bion's ear that they needed to adjust the results and score an equal number of points in the competition. Bion's eyes widened in surprise, and then embarrassed Baek Yang announced her proposal louder to all the third-generation students. Bion wanted to protest, but the other students managed to shut her up, and Bi Huan took the floor. He promised to announce the decision after they all discuss it. When the students of Udan left, Bi Ryun was outraged. Could it be that Bi Huan really intends to accept the offer and manipulate the results? Bion was also against it, because it wouldn't teach them anything. Moreover, if the elders catch them, they will get in trouble. Of course, she understood why Udan's students suggested it, since last time at Huashan they lost, but match-fixing is absurd for martial arts. Meanwhile, Bi Ryun did not give up, trying to shame the other students, but Bi Huan reminded them of what they went through after losing in the last competition. These words enraged Bion, who jumped at Bi Huan and began shaking him fiercely, urging him to remember the pride of a warrior. But unfortunately, Bion, the students followed the principle of the majority. And Bion, finding herself in the minority, was forced to admit defeat. She still could not believe that all the students agreed to this ridiculous conspiracy. They must have gone crazy. Suddenly, Bion was called by a familiar voice. Turning around, she found Baek Yoon, who squinted slyly. His sparring opponent was supposed to be Bi Ryun, and Bion could have allowed her to win the match. And if Bion worries that the difference in levels will be so obvious and they will be suspected of rigging the results, then Baek Yoon will allow Bi Ryun to make the first move. Bi Ryun could not believe that only she and Bion would be against the rigging of the results, but they had to adhere to the majority opinion, so they could not make the others change their minds. Of course, Bion did not think that the votes would split 2-28. After the meeting, Bion planned to conduct some mental training for all the students. Suddenly, Paik Gon joyfully jumped up to her and, smiling, said that now Bion would be able to fulfill her promise and fight her. Nevertheless, Bion was skeptical because they decided to rig the results, so she considered this match fake. But Paik Gon had no intention of agreeing to these conditions. She just wanted to fight her friend. But given the situation, it was necessary to decide who would win in their pair. Bion declared without hesitation that she must be the one to win. Baek Gon just smiled in response to the other answer. She hadn't expected it anyway. Leaning over, Baek Gon whispered that Bion's character is strikingly different from her neat and calm handwriting. Bion immediately jumped back. She herself knew very well that she was far from neat and calm. So should she change her character to better match her handwriting? To herself, Bion thought that with each passing year, Baek Gon was becoming more and more liberated. Possibly because she had helped Baek Gon 9 years ago. Here Bion sighed heavily. She wanted to talk to Baek Gon about the competition, so she suggested finding a secluded place. When they finally arrived, Beyond sternly declared that Baek Gon should not even think about losing. She must fight for victory and not think about the agreed-upon outcome. Baek Gon smiled in response. Beyond liked her just like that, not neat and calm. Then Beyond promised to become stricter and more serious and change her character to become the best swordsman in Huashan. Presenting this, Baek Gon laughed heartily, which greatly puzzled her friend. Beyond was worried that Baek Gon might get lost on the way back, so she suggested escorting her to the transparent marble annex. When they almost arrived, they found Bi Ryun and a third-generation Udan disciple. The Udan disciple was clearly embarrassed and worried, while Bi Ryun remained calm. Suddenly, the Udan disciple declared that he liked Bi Ryun and had fallen in love with her at first sight. But Bi Ryun showed no emotion at this confession, which surprised not only the Udan disciple, but also Beyond and Baek Gon, who were watching the scene intently from around the corner. After a brief pause, Bi Ryun replied that if the disciple was willing to give up his legitimate apprenticeship in Udan and transfer to Huashan as an exchange student, she would consider it. After all, the Udan sect is stricter about relationships, and if the boy is caught, he will definitely be expelled. Using Chi Talk, Beyond conveyed that Bi Ryun justifies the reputation of first love for 15 minutes. When someone blushes in front of Bi Ryun, their first love ends after 15 minutes due to physical or mental shock, which is why she got that nickname. As soon as the Udan disciple disappeared from sight in tears, Bi Ryun unexpectedly asked Beyond to stop hiding and come out. Although Bi Ryun delicately rejected the Udan disciple, she was worried that problems might arise between the two sects. But Beyond reassured her, suggesting that the disciple would be too embarrassed to talk about it. And, looking at Baek Gon, she added that even if two people have feelings for each other, it would be better to keep them to themselves and meet every 4 years as good friends. After an awkward pause that followed, Bi Ryun suggested to Baek Gon to go with them to the transparent marble annex, but she tactfully declined. When Baek Gon left, Beyond, stretching, suggested having a snack, as all the walking had made her hungry. Suddenly Bi Ryun decided to ask, did Beyond say it so that Baek Gon would hear her? Thinking for a moment, Beyond shook her head negatively. She was just saying whatever came to mind. But Bi Ryun knew Beyond too well, so there was no need to deceive her. Nevertheless, Beyond insisted that she said exactly what came to mind. Bi Huan gathered all the third-generation disciples in the male dormitory of the Huashan sect. He believed that the Wudang sect was trying to deceive them. Everyone present was very surprised, since Bi Huan immediately agreed when Wudang first proposed a draw. While Bi Huan was with them, things constantly went wrong, because the Wudang disciples were scolded by the elders for losing last time, but they would be scolded anyway, even if the match ended in a draw. Bi Ryun looked at everyone sternly. They had 1 day left before the competition, but she was glad that the others had finally started using their brains. Of course, Bi Ryun had understood everything long ago. She just couldn't say it while the Wudang sect was nearby, because she was sure that the 28 people who agreed had calculated all the risks. It turns out the proposal from the Wudang disciples could have been a conspiracy to lower Huashan's vigilance so that Wudang could take the victory for themselves. Finally, the day of the martial arts competition arrived. The tournament began with a match between Bi Huan and the elder of the Wudang sect. Beyond watched the duel intently. In the first match, they decided to give the victory to Wudang, but Bi Huan was putting on a fairly confident act, so the other students hoped the seniors hadn't noticed anything. But Beyond was not sure about that. The duel predictably ended with the victory of the elder of the Udan sect. After the duel, Beyond decided to ask if Bi Huan liked the first rigged match. Hesitating a little, Bi Huan answered that he was ashamed, even more than at the previous competitions. Nevertheless, Beyond was glad that he realized everything. After all, the third-generation Huashan disciples were mostly teenagers, and since it was no longer possible to refuse, Beyond hoped that they would at least feel ashamed and take this chance to grow up. But more importantly, what they suspected did not happen. All matches proceed as planned, so the duel between Bi Ryun and Baek Yun and the match between Beyond and Baek Gon will be decisive. Beyond was still a little nervous. Now each side had suffered 2 to 3 consecutive defeats. Noticing her nervousness, Bi Huan tried to calm her down. But these words had the opposite effect. Beyond looked at him menacingly. It was not worth falsifying the results of the duels at all. Finally, it was Bi Ryun's turn to enter the duel. Baek Yun, smirking arrogantly, asked if he should allow her to strike first as they had agreed. But Bi Ryun did not need it, so she refused. Then Baek Yun asked not to hold a grudge against him in the future. Here, Beyond wondered if they were really going to present everything as if Baek Yun lost because he lost vigilance. The duel began. Beyond was glad they paired these two together. As intended, the victory was won by Bi Ryun from Huashan. After the duel, Bi Ryun asked Beyond if there was any reason why she specifically had to fight Baek Yun. Beyond patted her on the shoulder, praised her for vigilance and promised to tell everything, but only after the end of the competition. The final duel began. Bion asked Baekgon to keep her promise, and not even try to underestimate or deceive her. Baekgon smiled in response and nodded affirmatively. Bion promised to fight Baekgon and tried to fulfill this promise for 9 years, and since she waited so long, Bion simply had to give her all. As soon as the duel started, Bion rushed forward swiftly. Baekgon managed to dodge, recalling Master Zhong Hui's words, "If you underestimate your opponent, you can quickly lose." This was a truly valuable lesson, coming from Zhong Hui's own experience of defeat against a Huashan disciple whom he underestimated. Baekgon considered this indispensable advice, especially when she thought about what she had endured joining the Wudang sect. And more importantly, you cannot look down on an opponent with eyes fierce like a predator's. Bion easily defeated Baekhyun 9 years ago, and 5 years ago swore to bring all her enemies to their knees using only 3 basic sword techniques. Even the scars and calluses on Bion's hands proved her incredible patience and many hours of training. No one seeing this could underestimate Bion. Of course, Baekgon already knew she would taste defeat today, but some unpleasant feelings still haunted her. Bion's next attack hit the target. Baekgon gasped and lost her balance, falling to the ground. Baekgon wanted to show her friend that she was no longer the weak girl everyone humiliated. The victory was won by Bion, and although Baekgon lost despite trying very hard, she dedicated her sincere feelings to Bion. Finally, Bion could breathe a sigh of relief. It was as difficult for her as during the match with Namgun Sehon. Extending her hand, Bion said that Baekgon had come a long way, and the duel turned out to be much more difficult than she expected. Shaking hands, Bion asked Baekgon not to blame herself for the loss, because losing to the best future swordsman of Huashan was no reason to be ashamed. The duels of the 3rd-generation disciples at the meeting of the Dragon and Tiger ended in a draw, despite all the ups and downs. Next were the matches of the 2nd-generation disciples. Yi Sun, whom Bion worried might leave the sect because of a loss, fortunately won the match against Zhong Hui this time. Summing up all the matches, the competition of the 2nd-generation disciples also ended in a draw. When the 1st-generation disciples also finished their matches, Bi-ryun once again gathered all the 3rd-generation disciples in the men's dormitory. She wanted to know what the true reason was that her opponent was Baekhyun. To which Bion replied that if Baekhyun had tried to pull off any tricks, Bi-ryun was the only one besides Bion herself who could have won without worries. To the surprise of the other disciples, Bi-ryun confirmed the senior's concerns, because Baekhyun attacked her with full force during the match. And if she had lost vigilance, she definitely would have lost. The other disciples were shocked, because Baekhyun was on the path of light and could not so easily step onto the path of darkness. That would have suited Bion more. In the end, everyone came to the conclusion that the Udan sect had indeed tried to deceive them, and their doubts were not unfounded. But still, from Huashan's side, it would be absurd to go and argue about it now. After all, Udan could simply claim that Baekhyun acted independently. Some suggested a radical approach, just to break into the transparent marble annex and attack the Udan disciples, while the other disciples tried to stop them. All eyes were on Bion. What should they do now? Could they really let Udan get away scot-free? To which Bion calmly replied that the disciples should learn a lesson from this scam and repay Udan in kind at the next meeting by defeating them honestly and fairly. The rigged meeting of the Dragon and Tiger came to an end, and for the next meeting in 3 years, the 3rd-generation disciples had to focus on training. Thus time passed unnoticed, and Bion's 15th birthday arrived. At that moment, the 3rd-generation disciples were in the Huaim village of Somso province. Bion was eagerly devouring local delicacies. Suddenly, they were scolded by the 2nd-generation disciple Yui Yun for coming down to Huaim during self-preparation without informing the elders. The disciples tried to justify themselves, saying they came down to Huaim because it was Bion's birthday. Of course, Bion understood that a birthday was just the day she was picked up at the gates of Huashan, and hoped the elders would forgive her anyway. But Yui Yun had a different opinion and dragged the clumsy disciples back to the temple, as a birthday was no excuse at all. Serving her sentence, Bion finally realized how foolish it was to hope that Yi Yun would not punish them. After all, she is ruthless, which makes Bi-ryun a perfect master. Sitting nearby, Hai Yun, Bi Huan's twin brother, was not surprised that Bion was caught, since she was having fun in Huaim, and the senior students always went down to the village. But Bion herself knew this. She just couldn't stand the teasing from Yi Sun, who by conviction had run away from the village himself. That's why Bion asked if Hai Yun knew a way to go out without getting caught. He nodded affirmatively. That place was the city of Xi'an, the place where the Cheongnam sect was located, which was on the southern slope of the mountain. Therefore, it would be safer to walk on the western side, which was closer to Huashan. Hai Yun even promised to show a secret hideout, But there was a problem. It took 2 hours to get to Xi'an, even using the lightness technique. And then Bion wondered if it was necessary to spend 2 hours to Xi'an when Huaim was right under their noses. And yet she wanted to walk and have fun without any worries at least once in her life, so she decided it was worth it. When Bion and the company finally arrived in Xi'an, they were very impressed by the city. It was much bigger than the village of Huaim, and there was nothing to worry about here. Suddenly, Birion placed her hand on Bion's shoulder, advising her not to cause trouble, since they were no longer in Huaim, where they could take care of all problems. Bion nodded affirmatively, but did not share her friend's concerns. Maybe Xi'an was a bit far, but they were still in Somso province, so what could happen? Therefore, Bion decided to enjoy her free time without adults, enjoying the variety of food and exploring the local sites. The fun lasted exactly until the moment the Huashan disciples crossed paths with the Cheongnam sect. Although the sects were in the same region, Cheongnam and Huashan were never friends. More precisely, it was Huashan, the contender for the title of the best martial arts sect in the world, who looked down on Cheongnam, which barely held its position among the 9 sects. In some novellas, the Cheongnam sect sometimes released heroes, but in The Return of the Sword God, this attitude was canon. Therefore, it was extremely important for Bion to keep the disciples from conflicts. She was sure that the third-generation Cheongnam students were wary of this because they knew how they were neglected. When the students caught up, Bion greeted them and suggested they simply disperse, as they did not want to cause problems for anyone. The students of Cheongnam nodded affirmatively. And just when everything was already behind, Bi-hun threw out a careless phrase that even dogs knew about Hae-yun's secret hideout. The students of Cheongnam took these words personally. Especially a boy named Yo-hyun reacted sharply. He immediately drew his sword and tried to attack. Bi-hun managed to react and block the thrust, but the blow was strong enough to make the sword slip from his hands. Bion immediately pressed her blade to Yo-hyun's throat and advised him to lower his sword at once. Sighing heavily, Bion tried to fix the situation by hinting that Bi-kun meant something completely different. Apologizing, she suggested lowering the swords and parting ways. But Yo-hyun did not hurry to sheath his sword. Only now Bi-hun began to realize that he had actually called the students of Cheongnam dogs. Suddenly Birion interrupted the conversation, stating that the elder Huashan had already apologized, and if the situation got out of control, they would all be in trouble. Suddenly a familiar voice called Birion by her old name, Ju Yi Ryun. It was Sun Lily. Ryun had not seen Sun Lily for a long time. Apparently, she still managed to pass the entrance exam to Cheongnam. Considering it fate, Birion sighed with relief. She was glad that everything was fine with Sun Lily. And since Birion, as the older sister, had already apologized, Ye-hyun had to immediately lower his sword, because students of the second generation of Cheongnam could run over at the noise. But to her surprise, Ye-hyun did not need Birion's apologies. He demanded that Bi-hun apologize to him for the insult. Bi-hun immediately asked for forgiveness for the misunderstanding. But Ye-hyun was still dissatisfied. He did not like the tone with which Bi-hun pronounced these words. Threateningly swinging his sword, Ye-hyun was going to take advantage of the chance given to him and show Huashan how strong the Cheongnam sect was. Bi-ryun's eyes widened in surprise because she did not think it would go so far and Bi-hun would be in danger. Therefore, without thinking for long, Bi-ryun threw her sword. Bi-hun skillfully caught it, managed to block the lunge, and immediately Ye-hyun called his comrades to arms. The students of Huashan also did not intend to stand aside. A fierce battle broke out in a second. The ringing of metal was heard everywhere. In the heat of the battle, Bi-hun lost concentration, and Ye-hyun was already ready to deliver a deadly blow. But unexpectedly, Bi-ryun came to the rescue, hitting the attacker on the head. The disoriented Ye-hyun was forced to retreat. Without delay, Bi-hun immediately handed the weapon to Bion. Now she had to face such a formidable opponent. Nevertheless, Yo-hyun had no intention of surrendering. Rage gave him strength, and he charged into the attack again. Bion was struck by the speed and persistence of Yo-hyun. But as the senior of Huashan, she had to set an example. Therefore, in response to the technique 36th Sword of Cheongnam used by Yo-hyun, Bion countered with the first move of the 24th Plum Blossom on the roadside. Unexpectedly, a second-generation disciple from Cheongnam arrived and stopped the fight. He immediately demanded an apology from Bion, but she declared that she would gladly apologize only after Yo-hyun himself asked for forgiveness for trying to bring their disciple to his knees. Behind Bion, a familiar voice suddenly sounded. It was Yui Seon. He was clearly displeased that only his disciples were apologizing since both sides were at fault. Then the disciple from Cheongnam protested and tried once again to blame Huashan for everything. Yui Seon, however, wanted to part amicably. Therefore, he threatened the disciple from Cheongnam that the matter could take a serious turn if he did not back down. a chill ran down the skin of the second-generation disciple from Jonam, and he immediately led the others away, unwilling to continue further. The disciples from Jonam disappeared, leaving Bion and the others in complete bewilderment, wondering what Yui Seon was doing here. Seeing the confusion on his disciples' faces, Yui Seon tried to explain that he came here to catch all the idlers. And then Bion realized that as soon as they returned to Huashan, they would all face punishment. In the elder's office, Bion told in detail what really happened. According to Bion, among the third-generation disciples of Chonam, a talented student appeared. These words made the elder think, all because Huashan invariably produced geniuses. In recent years, no prodigy or expert appeared in Chonam, while Huashan consistently produced famous talents. The martial arts world is a place where one expert can determine the rise and fall of a sect. So Huashan could not allow Chonam to seize power in Somso province. That is why the elder placed great hopes on Bion, as she was supposed to lead the next generation of Huashan. Bion could not believe her ears. But Elder Jin did not understand the student's surprise, since she had achieved impressive results in such a short time. So he considered Bion very talented. Of course, Bion did become arrogant after learning that she was better than her peers. But she simply considered herself a little gifted. Nevertheless, Elder Jin advised Bion not to do foolish things because one cannot blindly trust power. And then Bion thought, probably the elder mentioned this because one of the disciples who entered the martial arts world died at the hands of someone who follows the path of darkness. Elder Jin said everything he wanted, so he no longer delayed Bion. She said goodbye and promised to come back later. At the exit, she was met by Do-sun. He had heard that Bion called the elder and wanted to know what trouble his ward had gotten into again. Bion, smiling happily, replied that she had done nothing of the sort, and on the contrary, the elder called her a genius. For a second, silence reigned, and then Do-sun sighed with relief. Finally, Bion found out about it. Of course, he warned Yi Hyun to keep Bion's arrogance in check, so that she would not get too carried away with mastering skills and would take Yi-sun as an example. But Yi Hyun wanted Bion to grow as herself and not be suppressed. Nevertheless, Do-sun warned Yi Hyun that if Bion became arrogant, it could harm her in the future, since she was never punished in childhood. Instead, Yi Hyun decided not to point out Bion's talent so that she could learn how to be humble, but at the same time not suppress who she really is. Nevertheless, Yi Hyun advised Bion not to be arrogant and always to be modest about her skills. After all, the world of martial arts is vast, and there are many geniuses in it. Smiling, Bion promised that she would try very hard and never forget this. Seeing Yi Hyun and Yi Sun on the horizon, Bion said goodbye and swiftly rushed to them. Hugging Yi Hyun tightly, Bion promised to be the most respectful student and thanked him for his upbringing. Watching this touching scene, Do-sun thought to himself that from now on, the future of Huashan is in Bion's hands. Despite being recognized as a genius, as she had long dreamed, it did not bring her joy or inspiration. Reminder before sleep. The will of the great elder and the attack by the demonic sect that will happen in the future forced Bion not to be lazy in training. The desire to reach even greater heights led Bion to the martial arts pavilion, where there was a library that stored sacred texts on the study of Huashan martial arts. Bion was interested in texts about the sword technique of the 24th plum blossom. Suddenly her attention was drawn to Yi Wun, the person responsible for the martial writings pavilion, who was groaning, clutching his stomach. It turned out Yi Wun had eaten something wrong in the morning, and now had a very severe stomach ache, so he left the library, ordering Bion not to go far. As soon as Yi Wun disappeared, Bion's eyes shone with joy, for this was her only chance to see the secret texts of the forbidden section, and she immediately began to search for the most important secret text that the elders so diligently hid. Finally, Bion was able to find what she was looking for, but upon opening the scripture, to her regret, she could not understand anything. Suddenly her attention was attracted by a stack of records located on the neighboring shelf. Taking one of the books, Bion read the title, Flying Sword, Cleaving the Sky. Finding the title too threatening, Bion decided to consult the former greatest swordmaster of Huashan and the chief elder, Mu Yun. Bion was worried that cleaving the sky was often associated with demonic martial arts, and if not learned properly, it could lead to chi deviation. Carefully listening to all of Bion's concerns, Mu Yun asked to be brought the strange scripture. Carefully studying the text, Mu Yun concluded that it was clearly a secret text he had not seen before, but it was not related to the demonic sect. The original text clearly showed that it was a Huashan technique. Then Bion became curious. If this is really the supreme technique of Huashan, why was it hidden so diligently? But it was already clear to Mu Yun why she ordered Bion to draw his sword and stand opposite. As soon as Bion fulfilled her request, Mu Yun immediately attacked. Bion managed to block the strike at the last moment, feeling an unimaginable force. Turning around in horror, Beyond noticed behind her a crater formed by the force of the impact. It was the sword of Huashan possessing deadly energy. According to Mu Yeon, the Huashan sword originally does not resemble the sword of the Path of Light, so if it possesses great killing power, everyone will try to avoid it. Mu Yeon conveyed the writing saying that Beyond can independently master this art, but it was not advisable to use the Huashan sword at official events. Of course, Beyond understood that Mu Yeon controlled the intensity, but the deadly energy still made her tremble. Nevertheless, Beyond became curious. Why didn't Mu Yeon try to dissuade her? Sighing heavily, Mu Yeon explained that it was useless for her to persuade Beyond not to do it, as she had seen her eyes light up at the mention of the secret technique. So the elder Mu Yeon allowed it, and Beyond herself saw how powerful this technique was, so she decided to make the flying sword that cleaves the sky her signature move. The Central Martial Arts Alliance was restored for the first time in 29 years. After a large number of meetings, the alliance was restored by establishing the headquarters in Akyan and the main regional branches in Sachkon and Anvi. Of course, there were some complaints from the great sects and clans, which endlessly increased their power thanks to the alliance. But they were not strongly against this idea because the chances of an attack by the demonic sect were growing. And today the alliance headquarters will be opened for the first time. Thus, all martial arts masters gathered in one place. The great martial clans are families that hold a high position in the martial arts world thanks to their techniques. The Sashon-den clan, Jaegil clan, Mohaeon clan, Habok Feng clan, and Namgun clan. These 5 most powerful clans are called the 5 great families. In the martial arts world, they are recognized and treated as equals by the 9 sects as one union. There are also the 10 most famous and powerful martial groups on the Path of Light, which include the Sorim, Wudang, Huashan, Ami, Gonryun, Jeonnam, Jeomchan, Jeonsun, and Hondan sects, along with the Praying Alliance. The Wudang and Huashan sects have just encountered each other. When 2 sects competing for the title of the greatest sword sect in the world meet, conflict is inevitable. As soon as the disciples of both sects were even, Bihun immediately began accusing Wudang of cheating at the last Dragon and Tiger meeting. Baek Yang, who led the Wudang disciples, was already outraged by such words, but Bi Huan timely shut Bihun's mouth so that he wouldn't say anything unnecessary. Nevertheless, Bihun warned Bihun that it was not appropriate to quarrel in the presence of elders. But she also advised Baek Yang to ask Baek Yun why the Huashan disciples were so negatively disposed towards the Wudang sect. Glancing fiercely at Baek Yun, Baek Yang demanded immediate explanations. At first Baek Yun tried to evade, but then he finally broke down. He just put in a lot of effort to perform the perfect act, but apparently Huashan decided that he broke his promise and caused a serious fight. Biryun took these words as a personal insult, and, drawing her sword, demanded a duel right here and now. And if Baek Yun wins, she will admit she was wrong. Suddenly, Baek Yang slapped Baek Yun loudly and apologized to the Huashan disciples instead of Baek Yun, since no one wanted to start a serious fight in such a place. Rubbing his bruised head, Baek Yun noticed a stone in Biryun's hand, and immediately asked why she needed it. Baek Yun immediately covered his face with his hands, expecting the ill-fated stone to be thrown at him. But unexpectedly, Biryun threw the stone at a branch of a nearby tree where Namgun Sehon was hiding. He was extremely outraged by such treatment towards him, so quickly jumping down from the branch he approached Biryun. Sehon was very curious, as 2 great sects were about to fight for the title of the greatest swordsmanship sect in the world. But he was also interested in why, instead of reuniting with an old friend, Biryun chose to confront the Wudang sect, to which Biryun replied that not much time had passed, only 3 years. Seeing that the attention shifted from them to Sehon, Baek Yang decided to slip away under the cover of noise, so he quickly dragged Baek Yun away from new problems. Smiling, Baek Gon waved goodbye to her friend, promising to see her soon. Biryun also waved back. Nevertheless, Sehon was surprised why she was being friendly with Baek Gon. But Biryun did not understand why Sehon was so concerned, since she was just a friend. A light blush appeared on Sehon's cheeks, for he was also a friend. But Bion did not smile at him like that. On the contrary, she kept her distance. Hesitating a little, Sehon asked Bion to smile at him like that too. Not taking his words seriously, Bion quickly strode towards the gates, urging Sehon to hurry, for they needed to establish contacts and greet Feng Haran. Finding herself in the center of the martial arts world, Bion was breathless, for all the disciples of the 9 sects and 1 alliance whom she had never met were gathered here. Suddenly, Sehon, who was trailing behind, asked Bion not to believe anything others would say. Bion did not quite understand what exactly he meant. Suddenly, their attention was drawn by noise. Turning around, Bion noticed Feng Haran, and next to him a dark-haired guy who was actively arguing about something with 2 guys nearby. Feng Haran asked, Ryun not to make a fuss. Everything was fine with him, so there was no need to react so sharply. And then Bion, observing the situation, realized that this was the main character of Return of the Sword God, Jin Ryun, for only he could desperately defend Feng Haran. But to her surprise, Bion was calm. She thought that at the moment of meeting Ryun, the heavens would open and thunder would roar, but this did not happen. Therefore, Bion sharply called out to Ryun. Her blood boiled with the desire to fight the main character of the novel. Turning around, Ryun stared at Bion in surprise, not quite understanding what exactly she wanted. Apparently, Bion finally accepted who she was, for before she thought she was simply living in the world of the novel. But 10 years have already passed since Bion entered this world, and many years since she became a disciple of the Huashan sect. Through various meetings and farewells, Bion became the elder sister of the 3rd generation of Huashan disciples, and a member of the martial arts world. That is why Bion wanted to fight Ryun, because it is the undeniable instinct of a martial arts master. Since Bion was so curious, Ryun had no choice but to demonstrate all his skills. Suddenly, Feng Haran interrupted the conversation. He preferred that his good friends introduce themselves by name rather than fight with swords. These words slightly embarrassed Bion and Ryun, so they shook hands and introduced themselves properly. As soon as the formalities were over, Ryun suggested that if Bion wanted to fight, they could do it later at the combined martial arts tournament. To herself, Bion noted that Ryun had an amazingly calm character, just as he was in childhood before he went mad with hatred and thirst for blood. Remembering this, Bion felt a little ashamed and immediately apologized for her behavior. Suddenly, Sehan appeared behind Bion and declared that if she was going to have a sparring match, then he should be her opponent. Smiling slyly, Haran suggested to Bion to go check what was happening between the Huashan clan and the Dung clan. Bion was very surprised to hear such a proposal, but still decided to check it out. Suddenly, Sehan grabbed Bion by the hand and asked her not to go, since the Den clan should not become a big problem. Besides, Bion is the youngest. What can she even do? Of course, Bion understood that she was the youngest, but not the lowest in rank, and she was also the senior disciple, so it was her duty. The Sashon Den clan is one of the 5 great families focused on genealogy. Their specialty is poisoning and hidden techniques. In Return of the Sword God, they were mean and ruthless. Arriving at the place, Bion heard a scream and wondered what was happening here. Bi Huan immediately reported that one of the Den clan was speaking very boldly to Bai Rian, who asked not to be reminded of it. A tall, dark-haired guy named Den He Woon looked at Bion mockingly and asked if she was the senior. Then in the same manner, he added that Bion was more likely the junior, since the hierarchy in the Huashan clan was worse than that of dogs. Bion could not endure such an insult and struck Den Hu Woon with all her might right in the jaw. Could it be that Den Hu Woon did not understand that he would be beaten? How dare he call the Huashan clan dogs? Smiling, a dark-haired girl named Den Ha Kan approached them. She was amused that Den He Woon got into a fight with an unsuitable opponent. Bion immediately stopped the beating and looked at Den Ha Kan with surprise. It turned out she was the senior among the Den clan disciples. Could it be that she wants to take He Woon's place? But aloud, Bion said that for such a refined sect, its members had too sharp a tongue. And then Hakan was outraged, meaning only members of the Huashan sect were allowed to speak indecently. Then Hakan was overwhelmed by a wave of righteous anger. Not only did Bion raise her hand against a member of the Dong clan, but now she was also mocking them. Of course, Bion felt the poisonous energy emanating from Hakan. This girl was definitely strong. Suddenly, Sehan stood between them. They were attracting unnecessary attention, especially since wasn't Hakan's subordinate the first to get into a fight? In response, Hakan only smiled. Sehan was always impudent, but the fact that he sided with another woman made her look bad since Sehan was her fiancé. Bion's eyes widened in surprise. Could it be that this girl was Namgun Sehan's fiancé? Nevertheless, Bion ordered him to step back immediately. Looking around fearfully, Sehan reminded her that he said to ignore the foolish words of foolish people. Bion did not quite understand why she was more irritated than usual today, and with a cold look, she again ordered Sehan to move aside. Hakan was also ready to fight, and as soon as Sehan stepped back, she threw knives and large needles at Bion. Of course, Bion was able to deflect the attack, but Hakan was fast enough, and it was difficult for her to block all the targets at once. Moreover, Hakan possessed not only speed but also excellent accuracy. Hakan attacked again. With some difficulty, Bion was able to deflect this attack as well. Although Hakan was incredibly talented, she must have had a weak spot in her defense. After another attack, Hakan praised Bion, as she was sure that one of her hidden techniques had already struck the target. Now Bion had the advantage, but something was wrong, because the special technique of the Den clan was never stealthy. And then a malicious smile played on Hakan's face, and she asked Bion if she knew why poison is dangerous. You only notice it after it starts to act. Bion's heart began to beat wildly. Her feelings did not match each other. But when did Hakan manage? And then Bion realized that Hakan held the poison in the core of her chi, because only novices hide poison separately to throw it out later. Bion was angry at herself, because she knew that the main weapon of the Sashon Den clan was poisons, but still lowered her guard. The poison had definitely already started to act, so Bion made a cut on her left shoulder to somehow invigorate herself. She began to think chaotically, since she was already being poisoned. But last time, the energy of the medicine absorbed all the poison for her. Nevertheless, she had 60 years' worth of chi reserves available. A satisfied smile played on Bion's face. She had enough means to suppress the poison's effect, as she had done before. Moreover, the poison that Hakan used was lighter than the poison of the demonic sect. Therefore, Bion decided to use her internal chi to burn the poison circulating in her blood. Suddenly lunging forward, Bion planned to take advantage of Hakan's confusion and finish everything with one sweep. Hakan's eyes widened in surprise. She did not understand how Bion got rid of the Den clan's poison so quickly. Everything ended in a second. Bion made a precise lunge. Scarlet blood dripped onto the pavement, and Hakan, bowing her head to everyone's surprise, admitted defeat. The disciples of Huashan rejoiced and were about to rush to Bion to embrace her, but she sharply stopped them, for there was still poison in her body. Sehon immediately jumped up to examine Bion's wounds. It did not matter to him that there might still be poison in her body, and he demanded that Jae Galyun bring water immediately. Pouting, Hakan asked if Sehon did not want to examine his fiancé's wounds first, but he asked her not to put it that way. Smiling sincerely, Hakan acknowledged Bion's skills. She was strong enough to be called a senior in Huashan. Afterwards, she handed Bion a round pill. It was medicine to remove the poison. Sehon tried to stop Bion because they really did not know what it could actually be. But to his horror, Bion swallowed the pill without hesitation. Laughing, Hakan repeated again that it was just medicine to remove the poison. But Sehon could not fully trust one of the members of the Dong clan. Then Hakan reminded him that they would soon become a family, so he should not speak like that to his future wife. But Sehon shouted that even if he died, he would still remain a member of the Namgun clan. Nevertheless, Hakan ignored his remark. She demanded that Haewon apologize immediately with a proper bow. Here Haewon tried to object. After all, he was the direct heir of the Sashon-Dung clan. With a scorching look, Hakan reminded Haewon who was responsible for undermining the reputation of the Dung clan. Meanwhile, Bion asked Birion to come as well, since she was also a victim in this conflict. Bowing in a bow, Haewon apologized for the bold words spoken to them. Sighing with relief, Bion thought that all the troubles for today were over. Sehon very carefully applied a bandage to Bion's wound, and although it was his first time doing it, he tried very hard. Suddenly, their attention was drawn by Baekgon, who was rapidly running towards Bion. As soon as she reached her goal, she immediately began asking Bion about her condition. She also noticed that the bandage applied by Sehon was already soaked with blood. She immediately tightened the bandage more firmly. Of course, this was a temporary measure, and Bion should go to the hospital wing. Therefore, Baekgon offered to carry the wounded friend, but Bion tactfully refused, citing that there might still be poison in her body. Then Sehon intervened in the conversation. He doubted that Baekgon had immunity to poisons. What would she do if she got poisoned? And since Sehon had immunity to almost all poisons, he gladly offered himself as a carrier. Of course, Bion was very surprised to hear such words. Now she understood why the Den clan was so closely watching Sehon. When Bion reluctantly climbed onto Sehon's back, he smiled and noted that she was heavier than she looked. He seriously began to wonder if he should have offered that at all. Then Baekgon again offered herself, saying that if she got poisoned, she would just take medicine to remove the poison. But Sehon ignored her remark and rushed forward, leaving Baekgon smiling after him. Finally, Bion was in the chambers of Huashan, which took much longer because Sehon had topographical stupidity. The disciples of Huashan were glad to see their senior return. The adults said nothing about the incident, possibly because she won the fight. But Yi Hyun still asked Bion to come to him. Here Bion whispered to Bi Hwan, asking what the disciple from the Den clan had said that made Bi Ryan almost start a fight. Haewon noticed Bi Ryan's appearance, saying that with such looks she could easily become the concubine of the clan leader. Because of the time spent in the courtesan's house, Bi Ryan did not like receiving compliments about her appearance. Moreover, she had a strong sense of belonging and pride for Huashan. And then a wave of anger overwhelmed Bion. No matter how much she thought about it, one strike was clearly not enough. She seriously considered starting another fight, but Bi Hwan tried to dissuade her as best he could. Then Bi Ryan unexpectedly asked why Ha Kang from the Den clan made her subordinate apologize. Then Bion assumed she wanted to end everything without unnecessary problems. Of course, Bai Ryan noticed that her friend was upset about something. Perhaps she was just trying to vent anger instead of avenging her honor. Bion's gaze grew sad. She remembered a recent conversation with Sehon when they were returning to the chambers. Bion seriously asked if Ha Kang was really Sehon's fiancé, since she definitely wouldn't make such things up. A little embarrassed, Sehon explained that he and Ha Kang were not engaged yet, but he would have no choice. The eventful first day at the headquarters of the Martial Arts Alliance finally came to an end. The next day, everyone around was talking only about how Bion from the Huashan clan managed to defeat Ha Kang. All this greatly irritated Bion. She did not understand why everyone around was behaving like that. Could it be that Den Hakan was such a big shot? Smiling, Jaegul Hugh approached her and tried to explain what was happening. Den Hakan was the eldest daughter of the head of the Sashan Den clan and her first husband. She was a direct descendant and future heir. Moreover, among peers from other clans, hardly anyone was able to defeat her. Here Bion was a little embarrassed by the words about the first husband. Were there really more? Then Sehon interrupted the conversation, confirming her guess. The head of this family had 3 husbands and 4 lovers. Then Bion smiled, thinking that if a person has only one life, it would be nice to live it as the head of the Den clan. Unfortunately, she was an ascetic of a Taoist sect where marriages were forbidden. Hearing the conversation, Hakan approached them. She believed that a connection with the first husband and the greatest swordmaster of Huashan would be a good option. Bion was very pleased by Hakan's words about the greatest swordmaster of Huashan, but she did not show it. But instead of having a connection with Bion through someone else, Hakan preferred direct relations. Hakan liked Bion very much. She was impressed when she saw Bion swallow the antidote without hesitation. After all, people usually remained cautious even when she showed kindness. Nevertheless, she scolded Bion for her gullibility, advising her to be a little more careful in the future, because it might not always be true. Of course, Bion herself understood that she had made a mistake, but nevertheless she liked how lively and energetic Hakan was. Suddenly, Bion remembered that in Return of the Sword God, there was someone from the Sashan Den clan who helped the main hero. Could it really have been Hakan? Bion firmly shook the outstretched hand of Hakan. Smiling, she asked Bion to continue being a good friend to her fiancé, but not to get too close, as she would get jealous. That was all Hakan wanted to talk about, so after waving goodbye, she left Bion and Sehon alone. Sighing heavily, Sehon collapsed onto the grass. He was extremely irritated by Hakan's behavior. Of course, Sehon did not want to marry, but he could not refuse because it was Seun's choice. For Bion, it was quite obvious why Seun acted that way. She simply wanted to get rid of her younger brother, who otherwise could have become a rival in inheritance. Nevertheless, Bion believed that Hakan had some feelings for Sehon, but he just waved it off, saying she was simply trying to use him in her struggle for the position of head. Still, Sehon planned to do everything possible to refuse this marriage, and if that didn't work, he would run away to Huashan and become an exchange student. Bion was very surprised by Sehon's choice. Why did he choose Huashan? Blushing with embarrassment and turning away, Sehon stammered in response. Because Bion was there. Frozen in place from such a shock, Bion even opened her mouth in surprise. But after regaining her composure a little, Bion immediately got indignant, wondering if Sehon was trying to get attached to her because in the future she might become the elder of Huashan and its greatest swordmaster. Nevertheless, Sehon believed that she was not suitable for the role of elder, and this irritated Bion a lot. She felt nauseous every time Sehon said such nonsense. And then Sehon, unable to hold back, also declared that he felt nauseous every time Bion smiled at Baekgon, as if everything inside him was turning upside down. Suddenly, Bion suggested cutting all ties since they hated each other so much. Then Sehon began shaking Bion, demanding an immediate explanation as to why they should do such a thing. Finally, Bion was able to find those who gave her the nickname Mad Dog of Huashan. But the disciple of the Jongnam sect, Yeo Hyun, could not understand what Bion was dissatisfied with, since last time she attacked them like a mad dog. Sun Lily tried to ease the situation by asking what exactly Bion disliked about the nickname. Of course, Bion did not like being called a dog. Then Sun Lily suggested the nickname Mad Sword of Huashan. Bion liked this nickname a little more. At least she was no longer a dog. Suddenly, Feng Haran called out to her. He wanted to talk to Bion alone. When they settled in a secluded place, Bion finally decided to ask why Haran had so unexpectedly decided to talk. Haran smiled in response. After much thought, he came to Bion with a request to take care of So-ryun after his death. Of course, Haran felt that his days were numbered. By his calculations, about 5 years remained. Bion was shocked by these words, but why did Haran ask specifically her to take care of So-ryun? Then, smiling, Haran tried to explain. He believed that Bion would recover faster than anyone after his death, so he decided to entrust such a difficult task to her. Of course, Bion knew that Haran was a selfish child who did whatever he wanted, but nevertheless, she did not expect it. Knowing Haran's tragic end, Bion could not even be offended that he was trying to shift the despair of his friend onto her. Bion still hoped that Haran would be lucky enough to come across something that would cure his syndrome. Of course, she understood that the chances were slim, but miracles do happen. Nevertheless, Feng Haran asked her not to give false hope, since such miracles had happened to him. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by So-ryun, who asked Haran to go inside the house because of the too bright sun. He also asked Bion for a talk. When they were alone, So-ryun thanked her for the encouraging words towards Haran, and promised that under no circumstances would Bion have to take care of him. So-ryun also asked Bion not to be too hard on Haran, since he did not understand that this request would be a burden for her. But Bion did not even think about being offended. If she had been offended, she would not have told Haran to keep living. Smiling, So-ryun thanked her for her understanding and suggested that they get together sometime, just the three of them. Bion nodded affirmatively. After parting, Bion went to the square. She felt terrible. She could not stop the tragedy that was supposed to befall So-ryun or change the course of Feng Haran's death. So many things were supposed to happen besides the death of Fen Haran. The fall of Huashan was supposed to occur, and Bion had no idea what to do. Suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by the unexpectedly appeared Sehan. He noticed sadness on Bion's face and suggested that it was somehow related to his engagement. Despite her bad mood, Bion was glad to see Sehan, so she suggested they have a sparring match. At first Sehan was confused by such a proposal, and then refused, since Bion had reached a new level, while Sehan wanted to fight only when he reached his highest level. But Bion continued to insist on the fight, because for him it was a great chance to beat his record at least once. Nevertheless, Sehan considered this idea pointless. Then Bion was outraged, because many students wanted to spar specifically with her. Besides, she believed that defeat could be significant and used as a reason to become stronger. When Bion was depressed by defeat in childhood, there were several pieces of advice that cheered her up, and this applied not only to the match. Unexpectedly for herself, Bion realized that she must keep trying again and again despite defeats, and in the end she will be able to overcome all trials and become stronger. Therefore, Bion decided to do everything she was capable of. Of course, serious changes would not be immediately visible, but if she did not give up and continued trying, she would definitely become different. After all, Bion was not alone.